The city palace was far more luxurious than Abel had ever imagined. At its heart lay a magnificent fountain, its waters dancing under the glow of mysterious orange lights. The shimmering reflections created an ethereal atmosphere, amplifying the grandeur of the palace grounds. Servants dressed in pristine black uniforms guided guests with practiced grace, their demeanor impeccable. The guards, clad in gleaming half-body armor, each wielded a long sword with an air of seasoned expertise. Their presence was commanding, exuding the prowess of warriors trained beyond level 4 combat chi. It was a testament to the power and prestige of the royal viscounts. Within the palace walls, 3 primary warrior classes were dominant: warriors, knights, and assassins. Their training revolved around harnessing combat chi, a force capable of granting extraordinary abilities. Warriors were the most common, forming the backbone of combat forces. Their expertise spanned various weapons: swords, hammers, long spears, ensuring adaptability on the battlefield. Knights were the elite, trained from youth, granted the best equipment, and often mounted on war horses, their presence symbolizing power and nobility. Assassins were the rarest, requiring mastery in stealth and explosive combat chi techniques. Their strikes were devastating, but their energy burned out quickly. It was difficult to earn a noble title in the Duchy of Carmel. For generations, kings had devised ways to suppress noble power, implementing strict succession laws. Women were prohibited from inheriting, and landless lords saw their titles downgraded with each passing generation. If a noble died without an heir, their land was reclaimed by the monarchy. This ensured that fewer and fewer noble families remained. The only path to securing a title was through great service to the duchy. However, in times of peace, opportunities for such merit were rare, forcing many ambitious nobles to eagerly seek positions on the front lines whenever war loomed. Recently, tensions between the king and the nobility had escalated. Major noble families were consolidating power, while the king ruthlessly eliminated any who dared challenge his rule. Compared to neighboring duchies, the nobility in Carmel held far less power. In other territories, vast cities were ruled by dukes, yet here, a city as large as Harvest City was controlled by a mere viscount. Of course, these matters were distant concerns for Abel. His companion, Knight of Martial, had already secured his own fiefdom through military accomplishments. Titles mattered little to him now. He had only mentioned these political struggles to Abel in passing as they rode through the city. Yet, as Abel observed the sheer number of trained warriors within the city palace, he couldn't help but recall Martial's words. The major noble families were indeed strengthening their armies, an unspoken preparation for a possible rebellion against the king. Hundreds of well-trained warriors stood guard. Even at the lowest ranks, their combined strength could easily rival an army 10 times their size. A gathering of nobles. Inside the grand hall, the nobility had gathered. However, Abel was thoroughly disappointed by the food. Due to the winter season, the buffet was sparse, only cakes and roasted meats, while wine flowed abundantly. Before the cocktail party officially began, Viscount Dickens stepped forward to deliver a speech. Though the hall was packed, his combat chi amplified his voice, ensuring that every word reached his audience with clarity. As Marshall had explained earlier, this event wasn't just a social gathering. It was a display of wealth and military strength, a statement from the Viscounts proving they were capable of governing their lands. For Abel, it was the dullest event he had ever attended. He knew no one here. After being introduced to a few of Marshall's acquaintances, Abel quietly retreated to a corner, observing the lavish gathering from the sidelines. It quickly became clear why there was so little food. No one was eating. The nobility merely stood around, sipping wine and engaging in idle conversations. After spending the entire day walking through the city, Abel found the droning voices lulling him to sleep. His eyelids grew heavier and heavier, until finally, he drifted off. It wasn't until the end of the party that he was shaken awake by the Knight of Martial. Martial found great amusement in Abel's exhaustion, mocking him for dozing off at such an important event. A level 5 novice knight falls asleep at a noble gathering? Who would believe it, he teased. A spying servant, who had been standing motionless throughout the night, suddenly rushed away. His mission was clear: report back immediately. A dangerous pursuit. In a dimly lit room, Joshua's expression darkened upon hearing his servant's hurried report. They're heading toward the south gate? Are you certain? Joshua asked, his voice sharp. The servant nodded. Joshua's eyes gleamed. Then gather the men. Now, Joshua was the only son of a wealthy lord, a man whose fortune came from commerce rather than warfare. His father owned more than 10 major businesses in Harvest City, controlling over half of the city's clothing market. As a royal merchant, his influence was significant, but it was not enough. His ambition was far greater. At 19, Joshua was already a level 4 novice knight, and his father dreamed of securing a fiefdom for their family through battle. To that end, money was never an issue when it came to Joshua's training. He wielded an exceptional blade, the sword of 100 skills, purchased at an astronomical price. But now, he had lost it. After a failed gambling bet, Joshua had no intention of telling his father. Instead, his first thought was revenge. He gathered 12 of his strongest men, each armed and mounted on war horses. Joshua himself rode a blazing red steed, leading his group of 13 toward their target. A deadly encounter. Inside the carriage, the Knight of Marshall enjoyed a fine wine, gifted to him during their visit to Harvest City. Despite the rough ride, he moved with perfect balance, his wine glass unwavering. Abel, on the other hand, struggled. He tried to mimic Marshall's effortless composure, but the carriage lacked shock absorption. The vibrations caused his wine to spill, no matter how much he adjusted. Still, he observed closely, determined to learn. Then, a sudden change in the ground's vibrations made him tense. A chilling presence loomed behind them. Marshall lowered his wine glass, his expression turning cold. Interesting, he murmured. We're being followed. Abel, now on high alert, reached for his bracelet, readying his arrows in place of a missing sword. Ahead, Joshua smirked maliciously. Surround the carriage, he ordered. The 12 riders raised their blades, charging forward. The carriage driver, unshaken, called out, "This carriage belongs to the Harry family. Any attacker will suffer severe consequences." But Joshua's men were ignorant of the name. They continued their attack, halting the carriage in its tracks. Only when Joshua arrived did he see it. The white unicorn engraving on the front of the carriage. His heart plummeted. His face paled. He had just attacked a noble's carriage. But by now, there was no turning back. Kill them all. Joshua spat coldly. His men hesitated. They had never killed before, but they had no choice. With blades drawn, they charged forward. In the blink of an eye, a dark figure burst through the fluttering curtains of the carriage, the Knight of Marshall. Before the servants' swords could even graze the carriage driver, a blinding flash of combat chi erupted from his blade. Slice! In a single, fluid motion, the Knight of Marshall's sword cut through flesh and steel alike. The servants and their war horses were cleaved in two, their bodies suspended mid-air before a spray of blood painted the sky. A crimson rain fell, drenching those unfortunate enough to be standing behind. Terror gripped the remaining attackers. Yet, the Knight of Marshall did not relent. With an effortless leap, he descended upon one of the retreating men, his blade flashing once more. Schlick! A severed head spun through the air, brain matter splattering onto the ground before coming to a rolling stop in front of Joshua's horse. Joshua's entire body froze, horror gripping him as his limbs trembled uncontrollably. Thud! His legs gave out, and he collapsed off his horse, hitting the dirt in a dazed, pathetic heap. In mere seconds, 10 of his men lay dead. The 5 survivors, once armed and ready, were now shivering wrecks, their swords discarded on the blood-soaked earth. They had just witnessed the true power of a knight. This wasn't some bar brawl, nor the petty fights they had grown accustomed to in the city. This was a one-sided massacre, and the memories of this moment would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The price of cowardice. Even Abel was stunned. He had always known the Knight of Marshall as a kind, almost jovial figure, one who rarely showed any hint of aggression. But now, this was a different man entirely. The ruthlessness, the efficiency, the precision. This was the true nature of an official knight in combat. For the first time, Abel truly understood the difference in power. Joshua, still shaking, forced himself to speak. His voice was hoarse, his fear evident. "Sir, why you are a great knight. I am the eldest son of Lord Joel. I demand to be granted the title of noble prisoner of war." His words were a desperate plea. Not for mercy, but for status. It was a long-standing tradition. In the Knight's Code, battles were not about victory or defeat, but about honor. If a noble was captured, they were granted the title of prisoner of war, ensuring their survival and dignity. The system was built on mutual respect among knights, allowing ransoms to be paid, titles to be upheld, and political stability to remain intact. Even high-ranking lords followed this custom. It was an unspoken rule of war, a knight's judgment. The Knight of Martial looked down at Joshua, his contempt unmistakable. A novice knight, shivering in the mud, begging for privileged treatment, before even attempting to fight back. Pathetic. He scoffed, considering his options. Then, "Joshua," Abel's voice cut through the tension as he stepped down from the carriage, his gaze cool and measured. Looking at the pathetic heap on the ground, Abel almost found it laughable that Joshua had gathered men to attack him over something as trivial as a gambling loss. "You know him?" the Knight of Martial asked, his brows furrowing. He had suspected there was a prior conflict behind this ambush. But even among noble disputes, organizing an outright attack was considered extreme. After a moment of thought, Martial stepped back. This was an opportunity, a chance for Abel to make a decision, one that would test his judgment. "Abel," he said, "how do you want to deal with him?" A calculated decision. Abel regarded Joshua coldly. Killing him? Unnecessary. There was no advantage in slaying this foolish noble. But Joshua wasn't entirely useless. Abel glanced at the Knight of Martial, sensing that the older man would allow him to take control of the situation. A small smile crept onto his lips. "Joshua," he said smoothly, "let's take you back to the castle. I'll let you enjoy the title of noble prisoner of war." The Knight of Martial smirked, satisfied with Abel's response. Not only had Abel controlled his temper, but he had chosen to exploit Joshua's wealth, a far more useful punishment than spilling blood. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Joshua would pay his ransom, a price that would be funneled into the expansion of Harry Castle. The journey back. With Joshua's fate sealed, Abel disarmed the remaining 5 servants, tying their hands behind their backs using the belts from their own waists. Joshua, however, was left untied, his belt also taken, ensuring that if he attempted to flee, his pants would drop. Though humiliated, Joshua remained still, his fear overpowering his pride. The surviving war horses were rounded up, and the prisoners were forced onto their saddles. Abel, now mounted on Joshua's own blazing red warhorse, led the procession back to Harry Castle. A lesson in power. By the time they reached the castle, the captives were handed over to the housekeeper, Lintz. Negotiating ransoms was housekeeper business, not a knight's concern. Without hesitation, Lintz began identifying the prisoners, preparing to extract the maximum compensation from their families. Abel, satisfied, returned to his daily routine. Mornings were spent training and forging in the blacksmith shop. Evenings were reserved for knights' breathing techniques and rest. With each passing day, his strength and skill continued to grow. A blacksmith's legacy. A month passed in this rhythm. Abel had successfully forged 5 long swords using only the basic techniques of this world. Unlike his previous works, he refrained from using special carburization methods, choosing instead to focus on the fundamentals. His dedication did not go unnoticed. Even Master Bentham praised him highly, recognizing his growth as a blacksmith. Then, one morning, Bentham summoned him. The dwarf's secret. Inside Bentham's private office, the old blacksmith retrieved a heavy, metal-bound book from a secured chest. "My teacher," he said, "was Master Robin, a dwarven forging master. When the dwarves and humans allied against the orcs, I was sent to train under him. A distant glow appeared in Bentham's aged eyes as he reminisced. They were the greatest blacksmiths, the culmination of thousands of years of craftsmanship. Some say that the most powerful dwarves forged weapons for the gods. Abel listened intently, his curiosity piqued. But beyond normal forging, Bentham continued. Master Robin could create magical weapons. I begged him to teach me, but he refused. He said I lacked the talent. Bentham's hands tightened around the book. But he left me this. This is the magical weapon forging guide. He placed the massive tome in Abel's hands. For years, I believed it would remain useless. No blacksmith possesses the spiritual power needed to forge true magical weapons. But you, Abel, you are different. Abel's heart pounded. For the first time, someone had openly acknowledged the existence of magic to him. A promise. Bentham's eyes burned with hope. I am old, Abel. I will never forge a magical weapon in this lifetime. But you, my student, you can. Abel met his master's gaze. Master, I will try my best. Bentham smiled, handing him the forging guide. A new path had opened, and Abel was ready.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
I have all the materials you need. Although I have been collecting them for many years, it is only recently that I've found the perfect fire magical gems and ice magical gems. Master Bentham said. Meanwhile, he opened a box that contained all the things that he had just mentioned. Is this it? Within those materials, somethings looked very familiar to Abel. It was 3 red gems and 3 blue gems. He took the 6 gems out of the box and inspected them carefully. They were the ones he sold at Harvest City earlier. These are the fire magical gems and ice magical gems I was talking about. It was so hard to find such perfect ones like these, but luckily I had found these in Harvest City. Looking at how excited Master Bentham was, Abel wondered if the price of these gems were much higher than the price he had sold them for. If he mistakenly sold magical gems as normal gems, what would be the actual value of magical gems? But Abel decided not to ask. He didn't want to regret his decision even further. Your task in the future will be sketching out those runes. Make sure the angle, force, and the thickness of the strokes are the same. Master Bentham repeatedly emphasized as he took out a brush from a box. Is this an ink brush? Abel was shocked once again. Ink brushes were one of those things that Abel was all too familiar with. From the tip of the brush to the body of the brush, this brush that Master Bentham was holding looked exactly like an ink brush from Abel's original world. Master Bentham explained as he handed the rune brush over to Abel. Ink brush. I like that name, but it's called a rune brush, boy. The body of the brush was made out of a kind of wood that is resistant to magic, which prohibits other external magical force interrupting the rune's writing process. The tip of the brush was made out of the softest handful of fur located in the very back of a wind wolf's head. The wind property of a wind wolf allowed the brush to deliver runes ink more efficiently. Add it Novel Benedict. This rune brush is very difficult to master. There are lots of training and learning you need to do until you could draw the lines of the rune correctly. Here, give it a try, said Master Bentham to Abel as he took out a bottle filled with normal ink. He opened the lid and placed it on the table. Then, he took out a piece of lambskin parchment and also placed it on the table. Abel held the rune brush by gripping it between his middle finger and the ring finger, while his thumb pressed against the body of the brush. He then proceeded to dip the brush in the ink bottle and gently whipped off the excess ink. A glance at the runes in the book. In one take, he wrote down the entire first page. Master Bentham was stunned as he watched by the side. The master himself had been practicing to use a rune brush for more than 20 years. Yet, his position and control of the rune brush were not even as good as Abel's first attempt. Even basic things such as grasping the amount of ink the brush needed to be dipped had taken Master Bentham countless trial and errors. Although there was still a bit of disparity when it came to Abel's replication of the runes. He was able to recognize when the lines should be smooth, straight, or curled. These runes were no worse than the ones written by Master Bentham. As long as Abel kept on practicing, he could have surpassed his master in no time. Master Bentham could not help but feel the waves of jealousy sprung up from within as he lamented on the god's bias from the inside. He had never heard of a person of Abel's age becoming a 5th-level novice knight. He had also never heard of a person who was able to forge a sword of 100 skills after only a month of training. Even the power of what he had so deeply desired was possessed by Abel. Now when it came to writing runes, Abel had also excelled. His first attempt was already on par with those who dedicated decades of effort. Master Bentham could not take it anymore. He waved his hand at Abel and said, "Okay, you can go back to practice by yourself now." As that being said, Master Bentham took Abel out of his room. He needed time alone to lament with his injured soul. After Abel sensed that maybe Master Bentham dissatisfied, he packed up all his things and went back to his room in the castle. There was not a quiet place in the blacksmith shop for Abel to practice writing runes in peace anyway. If Abel knew what Master Bentham is thinking, he would have told him, "Oh no, you are overthinking it. I only know how to use an ink brush, and this amusing thing is a rune brush." In Abel's previous world, he had been systematically learning how to use an ink brush since the beginning of elementary school. Even after he got a job, he did not give up on this hobby. From time to time, he would take out an ink brush and wrote down a few characters to enhance his mood. After a week of training, Abel was able to completely master the 4 magical rune characters. The sizes and proportions of the strokes were perfect. However, during the process, he also realized that the fire magic rune character seemed very familiar to him. It looked very similar to the 8 #RAL rune in Diablo II. However, there were a lot of connecting lines in this fire magic rune. Some were responsible for connecting to the hilt of the sword, and some were responsible for connecting the entire body of the sword. Overall, the structure of the rune, as a whole, still very similar. The purpose of the 8 #rune was +5, -30 fire damage, which was also similar to this fire magic rune. Could it be that the rune of this world was related to the runes of the Dark World? Legend has it the Dark World's rune system had been long lost. To create a rune system, the only way was to use an ancient runestone to realize the power of each rune. Therefore, since the runes still existed in this world, if one had mastered more runes in the future, maybe they could also turn all the rune of Diablo II come into reality. But for now, it was still too early to say. Abel had only mastered 4 runes. To establish a rune system, it required the combination of the entire 33 rune characters within Diablo. As for the 4 runes Abel had mastered, after careful analysis and identification, Abel had corresponded them to the runes of Diablo II. They were individual, the Fire Magic 8 #rune, Ice Magic 10 #rune, Electric Magic 9 #rune, and Poison Magic 7 #rune. However, there was one rune system that Abel could remember from memory. If it wasn't because this rune system was generally ranked at the top, out of the many rune systems, Abel wouldn't even remember that it had even existed. The rune ability in this rune system was terrible in Diablo II. It wasn't even as good as any ordinary low-level dark gold. This rune system was called the Ancient Vow. The Ancient Vow. Material required, 3 Kong Shield. Rune required, 8 # +9 # +7 #. Ability of the final product. General defense plus 50%. Ice defense plus 43%. Virus defense plus 48%. Fire defense plus 48%. Electricity defense plus 48%. 10% of damage could be converted to magical power. Able though it might be doable. Although its attributes were not that good in the game, it would be a powerful shield in reality. So Abel had decided after he had mastered all the single rune weapons, he would proceed to make this shield. The next day, Abel returned to the blacksmith shop with the rune brush and the ink bottle. He found Master Bentham and said, "Master, I have mastered the 4 runes. I want to start making magic weapons today." By this point, Master Bentham had been shocked by Abel's speed of mastery way too many times. He had become completely immune to it. Even if Abel were to master the rune brush a few more days faster, he wouldn't be any more surprised. Master Bentham took out a sword of 100 skills that had Abel forged a while ago. This was because the Knight of Martial had stipulated long ago that Abel have the right to possess all the weapons he forged himself. Since Abel would one day inherit the castle, he should be able to use the iron as resources as well. Upon completing these swords of 100 skills, Abel would often carelessly leave them in this operation room, which was assigned by Master Bentham as Abel's private room. If an ordinary person had entered this room, they would go insane. The floor was scattered with more sword of 100 skills than all the weapons store combined in Harvest City. There were only 3 masters with the ability as high as Master Bentham, supplying their weapons to the weapons stores in Harvest, and Master Bentham could only forge 1 sword of 100 skills in a month at most. Therefore, the limitations of masters can be clearly seen. To progress from forging 80 skills to a 100 skills weapon, if one did not possess the power of will, the only way was to rely on experience and a large number of mental calculations. Masters would normally start from 80 skills and slowly forge 1 or 2 more skills onto the weapons each day. Only a blacksmith who possessed the power of will, such as Abel, could forge a weapon from 80 to 100 skills in one take. However, these days, Master Bentham no longer needed to send his weapons to another weapon store to sell. This was because in exchange for Joshua, Lord Joel had given the Knight of Martial a weapons store, located in the most prosperous part of the Harvest City. While as for the 5 captured servants, they had also been generously sent back. That weapon shop, which was worth more than tens of thousands of gold coins, was now bringing more than 500 gold coins per month to Harry Castle. Abel removed the decorations from the sword of 100 skills handle, leaving only the metal part of the handle, hilt, and gauntlet exposed. Therefore, the gauntlet was now the only part where the magical gem could be placed. Abel placed the hilt of the sword of 100 skills into the furnace. After a while, he took the burning red sword out with a clamp, then took out a hammer drill and trimmed a suitable hole. When Master Bentham saw the sword, he was very pleased with Abel's proficiency in his forging foundation. One of the main reasons that Abel wanted to learn forging was to master his own power. During his spare time, he would practice different forging skills in the operation room. Each forging skill that he practiced had their very own unique powers. After all the training Abel did, he could control and maintain his skills firmly and steadily. Master, I want to forge an ice magic sword. Due to issues with materials, Abel had to choose between fire and ice magic weapons. In his understanding of the ice magic weapons, it could slow down his opponent's speed alongside the damage caused by the ice magic. The finished product would be a devastating nightmare for anyone who encountered it. Master Bentham remained silent as he nervously watched Abel took out his runes brush. After Abel dipped it in ink, he began to write the runes onto the sword. Due to many years of using a normal ink brush, Abel's hand muscles were very well developed. Therefore, he did not find it too hard to use the soft rune brush. However, the ink used to write runes were different from the ones normally used to write on ink paper. The process of writing ice runes on the sword of 100 skills was a lot more difficult. With every stroke Abel wrote on the sword, he could feel waves of resistance. This was the case despite that the brush was made with wind wolf fur, which was supposed to limit the resistance force by at least half. Sweat began to flow down from Abel's head. Not only writing the runes required strength, but it also required high energy consumption from his heart. This was because the writing had to be done within one breath, and it could not be paused any time during the writing. If there was a pause, the thickness of the ink would be different, and the magic being transmitted would have gone out of Abel's control. Despite having taken half an hour, Abel's writing runes on the sword of 100 skill took almost 3 times longer than normal writing would. Ultimately, the deed was done. Abel took out a blue gem and carefully placed it into the hole. He reinforced the hole with different tools so that if the hole began shaking, the gem wouldn't accidentally shake or fall out. Let me see. Master Bentham asked Abel for his sword of 100 skills. He carefully examined it and said, "You can write runes even faster than me. They are perfectly drawn, and the magical stone has no problem with it. I think we can proceed to the next step." Being able to see Master Bentham's affirmation of his capabilities, Abel's face began to express joy. The process of drawing these runes was difficult, and it had taken a lot of willpower out of Abel. So he sat down on the ground and rested for almost an hour before he was fully recovered his energy. Abel carefully used his willpower to draw from the blue gem to the edge of the ice magic stone, according to Master Bentham's instruction. An ice-cold force rushed back at Abel as he continued to use his willpower. He then began to guide this ice-cold force carefully into the strokes of each rune. This process could not be too fast, or else the ice-cold force would be left behind, thus returning to the blue gem. However, it could also not be too slow, or else the ice-cold force would freeze his willpower. On the 5th attempt, he finally successfully used his willpower to guide the ice-cold force onto the middle of the rune. Suddenly, the sword of 100 skills shined with a dazzling light. Abel seemed to hear the sound of the sword blade shattering. Without a second thought, he threw his sword of 1,000 practice outside, while Master Bentham was concentrating behind the huge iron controlling desk. Suddenly, there was a loud bang sound, and all Abel heard was the sound of fragments and splinters shattering everywhere through the air. It was then followed by the sound of objects being hit with a sound of ding-ding. After a while, the sound came to complete silence, and everything was suddenly quiet. Abel slowly poked his head out and glanced at the area where the explosion happened. The operations room was in complete chaos and disorder. The walls inside the room were filled with holes. Fortunately, the operation room was made of boulders, and the tools inside the room were all made from fine quality iron, which meant that most of the equipment inside the rooms wasn't damaged, with the only damage being a large pit on the ground. Master Bentham recovered from the scene with a shocked face. He looked directly at Abel in the eyes, and the two individuals suddenly felt as if they were survivors of a close-call disaster. "What's the matter? Master, are you all right?" All of a sudden, there was a loud noise coming from nowhere. Then the door of the workshop was promptly opened, and everyone in the blacksmith shop rushed and crowded inside. That bang, noise that occurred, has shocked and frightened everyone that was near. The room was filled with gasps and dreadful looks on people's faces, and for a moment the crowd stared astoundedly at Master Bentham and Abel. They thought to themselves what they were doing here that could have been so powerful and devastating. "All of you better keep your mouth shut. Nothing happened here, all right? Now, get out of here before I make you." Master Bentham roared like a bear. He was kicking everyone out. The crowd, the gardener, even his own apprentices, everyone. Why did this happen? Abel was a little surprised by this failure, because he thought he did very well this time. The process was very smooth, so why did it fail in the last moment and also cause a last-minute explosion? Master Bentham picked up the ink carefully and examined it. He carefully sniffed it with his nose and twirled it with his hand. Finally, he said firmly to Abel, "There is nothing wrong with the ink. I have produced this ink for many years now, and it was made in accordance with the same formula. There's no way it would have been like this. Had it novel been at? Then that means something went wrong in the process." Abel thought back to his own production process, and nothing was missing except that it took 3 times longer than usual to draw the runes. With that in mind, Abel said firmly, maybe the runes were drawn for a little too long. Yes, after a long time, the first and the last ink may be exposed to the outside environment for too long. The ink properties of the 2 periods may have changed, followed by an unstable magic transmission, which may ultimately lead to the explosion. Master Bentham analyzed carefully. He had spent his entire life studying the material. When Abel was making assumptions for the reason of the explosion, he had already found out the cause for the explosion. "Can you use your power of will to draw the runes? Wouldn't that be faster?" asked Master Bentham, who, as he did not possess such powers, couldn't do anything to help apart from making suggestions. Abel thought for a moment and answered, "There shouldn't be a problem. It's just that my power of will was a little bit depleted. It's going to take up a lot more time for me to rest before I can use it again." Once again, they picked up another sword of 100 skills found from the ground and punched a hole into it for the gem. This time was much faster than the first time, since Abel now acquired some experience from his first attempt. It was time to draw the runes again, and Abel closed his eyes while emptying his mind. As he slowly opened his eyes this time, he began to zoom in on the sword with his sight. Every detail on the sword was magnified multiple times larger than its original size. When the runes were drawn on the sword with ink, the two continued to fuse very tightly. It created a special coating, which was why the resistance was so strong when the runes were being drawn. The speed of Abel's willpower corresponded with the speed of his runes brush perfectly. There was already a night and day difference comparing this to his first attempt. The whole thing was finished in 10 minutes. Abel returned from his powerful state, and by that point, he was already fully exhausted. It took Abel 2 hours to recover from his exhaustion. Now he had gained experience of how to guide the ice-cold force with his power of will without any pauses or interruptions. Next time, he could lead the cold force into the middle of the runes at a much quicker and steadier pace. The sword of 100 skills flashed with a glaring ray of light. This time, the light was not dazzling, and the sword covered by the runes began to shine. Slowly the lights began to dim, and the rune disappeared from the surface of the sword, and the sword returned into its original appearance. In addition to the sword handle's hole slot, there were no differences between the newly crafted sword and the original sword of 100 skills. Master Bentham took the sword of 100 skills with his trembling hands and tapped it with his fingers. The sword flashed a cold light, and Master Bentham's fingers were covered with frost. Abel saw the frost on Master Bentham's finger and immediately asked, "Master, are you all right?" "Haha." Master Bentham laughed wildly, tears streaming from the corners of his eyes. He began to mutter words. I never thought that I could live to see the day where one of my disciples could be making magical swords. Finally, I can die without any more regrets." Abel used a few normal gems to redecorate the big sword's handguard so that no one could see the internal magical power of the gems held within the long sword. He repolished handguards, along with a curved decoration strip made, as well as adjusting the small and shattered gemstones of the sword. This transformed the sword from a normal sword of 100 skills and ultra-luxury, deluxe edition of an ice magic sword of 100 skills. The explosion that occurred on the other day had dispelled Abel's plan to create the ancient vow rune. The defense power he possessed was nowhere as strong enough to withhold its power. It would be very dangerous if it exploded again during his second try. Time flew, and in a blink of an eye, 3 months had already passed. Nowadays, Abel was living a very fulfilling lifestyle. He has already forged over 12 swords of 100 skills, one of them being the ultra-luxurious, deluxe edition of the ice magical sword of 100 skills. He even produced 5 shields of 100 skills, made of rough iron. These shields were made as preparations for his future plan to make the ancient vow in the rune system. It was already April, and the weather was becoming warmer and warmer. People who worked in the forgery had already begun forging weapons right from the morning. "Abel, you and I are going to the Blacksmith's Union in Harvest City today," said Master Bentham as he looked towards Abel, who was still recovering his energy to make another one of his 100 skilled bases. "Why are we going to the Blacksmith's Union at Harvest City, and what are we doing?" Abel questioned Master Bentham with a strange look on his face. Master Bentham replied to Abel's question with an excited tone. "After you made the magic sword, I have requested a sword master from the Blacksmith Union to assess your sword. I got the news from the Blacksmith Union yesterday, and they notified me that they will be assessing you tomorrow." "Congratulations, Master." Abel knew Master Bentham was only called the Blacksmith Master Bentham by the locals. Being able to make 100 skilled rough iron was only the fundamentals of becoming a master. In order to truly be approved by the Blacksmith Union as a blacksmith master, one would need a very diverse and profound skill set. Therefore, Master Bentham was only a competent master, but not a blacksmith master. "Why are you congratulating me? I'm only the person who helped you apply." Bentham gently patted Abel's head. "For my entire life, I have been trying to forge magical weapons. I will never succeed to make one, though, and that's why I could never become a real blacksmith master. However, the fact that you can make magic weapons, it shows that you are already worthy to surpass what I'm capable of." At first, Abel doesn't seem to have a lot of interest in becoming a blacksmith master. However, when he realized that he could learn more runes if he becomes a master, as well as on the strong recommendation from Master Bentham, he agreed and said, "I will go and prepare now." Abel loaded 9 normal swords of 100 skills and 1 luxurious, deluxe edition of the Fire Magic Sword of 100 skills on a Master Bentham horse carriage from his private operating room. Abel decided to leave 2 of those normal swords of 100 skills at his own, Harry's weapon shop. The rest of them were being sold in Edmund's boutique shop for money. If all the swords were being sold through Harry's shop, it would hugely impact the prices of those swords in the local market, which would also lead to suspicion from other weapon shops. Ultimately, this could bring a huge disadvantage to his shop in Harvest City, which was just taken recently off the hands of Lord Joel. One of the main advantages of trading it to Edmund's boutique shop was that they have distribution shops all around the country. This meant that they could easily sell off the 7 swords. The luxury sword, on the other hand, could be auctioned off by the boutique shop, which would generate a large amount of profit for Abel. The carriage trip to Harvest City was bumpy, as usual. Abel already had plans of crafting a vibration-damping carriage so that the ride won't be as bumpy. At around 10 a.m. in the morning, the horse carriage finally arrived at the Blacksmith's Union, which was located in the center of the town. At Novel Benedet. The Blacksmith Union was a multinational organization in the mainland. The organization was created 3,000 years ago by a couple of humans and dwarfs, who were all blacksmith elders 3,000 years ago. After all these years, even the orcs have joined the organization. This ultimately formed the Blacksmith Union that was known today. The unions mainly assessed the blacksmith's ability and handed out medals according to their skill level. However, they also provided protection for those blacksmiths who had joined the organization. The moment Bentham and Abel entered the union's hall, a dwarf with a large beard walked towards them. This was the first time that Abel had seen a dwarf in his life. He tried his very best and controlled himself from not staring at the dwarf. "Bentham, my old friend, the union notified me to host as soon as they heard about your application." The dwarf then held his arms wide opened, and Bentham lowered his body to give him a hug. When they finished hugging each other, Bentham laughed and said, "I can't believe the union is telling you to host the assessment. I still remember the days where we were being taught by Mr. Robin. After so many years, you still look so young." Abel was a little speechless as he looked over at the dwarf with his face covered with his large beard. He couldn't imagine what Bentham meant when he said that his dwarf friend was young. "This is my student, Abel and Harry." Bentham pointed at Abel, who was standing on the side, and introduced him to the dwarf. Bentham then turned around and said to Harry, "This is Master Soren Oakshield, a junior who studied with me." Soren Oakshield jumped in and yelled, "I am your senior. Mind you, back when we studied together, when I was a young adult, you were still a child. So, of course, I am your senior." Bentham laughed. "Oh, I am older than you, yet I was still a child?" Master Soren yelled as he waved his fists around. Abel finally understood the argument between the two of them as he watched from the side. Dwarfs generally had a longer lifespan, usually about 500 years. But normal humans could only live for around 100 years, so that's why they were having this banter with one another. Master Soren knew that there wouldn't be a point to continue to dwell on this topic, so he quickly turned his head and began talking about Abel. "So, is this the person that will be assessed to become the new blacksmith master? He is way too young. You only have one chance in your lifetime to apply for an assessment to become a blacksmith master, and you gave it to him." These questions clearly showed that Soren did not trust Abel's ability. Every skill that a blacksmith acquired needed time to perfect and master. "I am almost 60 years old, and I am losing my essence. I am afraid that I cannot become a blacksmith master anymore. I would never have the chance to use this application, but dash." Master Bentham looked directly towards Abel and said, "Ever since Abel became a student of mine, he had created miracles again and again. I believe that he has the ability to become a master blacksmith, and that's why I brought him here for an assessment." "Okay, up to you then. Let us begin the assessment." Master Soren led both of them into the workshop. There were 3 mirrors placed on the wall. There was a blacksmith workbench in the middle with all the tools that they need, and there was also a blacksmith furnace on the side that was burning. Soren then took out 6 red gems and placed them on the notch of the wall. All of a sudden, the mirror's surface began to shake. 3 figures, including a dwarf and 2 humans, began to emerge. Master Bentham then proceeded to bow to the 3 figures in the mirror. "Hello, masters. Sorry for interrupting your time." Abel seemed to be quite amazed and shocked at the same time. Then, Master Soren began to explain the procedures of the assessment to him. Master Blacksmiths had 5 chances to apply for a Grandmaster assignment. A top-tier blacksmith was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. After the application was passed, there would be a Grandmaster here to be the witness, and the other 3 will be remotely assessing the processes of the procedures through a magical array. This type of magic array was made by the Array Master of the Elves. It could only transfer images, but it cannot transfer sound. "Let's start," Master Soren said to Abel after explaining the rules and procedures. Abel remained silent. He first bowed to Master Soren and the 3 masters on the mirrors. The raw materials on the workbench were very high quality. Abel took a piece of the material and threw it into the furnace. After a short period of time, he took out the material and hammered it back and forth. Due to his highly trained proficient skill and speed, it only took a little over 2 hours to forge the material to the 80 skills. Now he only needed to further forge them from 80 skills to 100 skills. Since he was using up his power of will, the speed of him forging the material from 80 to 100 was even faster than before. Master Soren began to look at Abel in a new light. The skillful use of his power of will when it comes to forging was not very common among the masters. Instead, most masters would use their experience to forge the martial from 80 skills to 100 skills. It didn't take long for the materials to be forged to 100 skills. After taking a small break, Abel began to shape the sword. The time flew past quickly, and the sword has taken its shape. Abel did not stop there. He proceeded to use the chisel to open a small indent on the handguard. This move suddenly grabbed Master Soren's attention. He immediately turned to Master Bentham with a look of doubt. But Master Bentham nodded back to Soren confidently, confirming his belief in his student. Master Soren knew that although Bentham had been trying to forge a sword like this for his entire life, Bentham had failed. However, now it seemed that his student was able to complete his cherished desire. The moment Abel took out his rune pen, Master Soren's confirmed his suspicions. Magical weapons were some of the highest tier weapons. It was considered precious even from a master tier weapon perspective, seeing that Abel was in a state of deep focus as he drew the runes. The 3 masters in the mirror immediately knew what weapon it would be. Therefore, they began to pay even closer attention. The final process of embedding the blue gem and the guidance of the power of will went smoothly. Soon, an ice magical sword was completed. Although it was not decorated, the masters agreed. This ice magical sword was fabulous, and it had well surpassed the blacksmith master examination standards. Master Soren turned around and looked at the 3 figures in the mirror. After all the masters nodded in confirmation, Master Soren took out a medal from his chest directly and spoke to Abel with a serious tone. "Congratulations, Abel Harry Master. You are now the 36th blacksmith master in the Blacksmith Union." After these words, Master Soren placed the medal in front of Abel's chest. He then stepped up and gave Abel a hug. Just like Master Bentham, Abel also bent down to return Master Soren's hug. This gesture of kindness showed that Master Soren was now treating Abel as an equal. The 3 masters from the mirror have also bowed at Abel. As soon as Abel finished returning the bow, the figures vanished from mirror. Because Master Bentham and the Knight of Martial had businesses to discuss together, the Knight of Martial had arranged it so that he would come to the council to pick them up back to the castle after 2 hours. In the meantime, Abel sat on his carriage and went off towards Edmund's boutique shop. When Abel entered Edmund's boutique shop, Yvette was nowhere near in sight. So Abel went towards the counter and asked the male assistant, "I'm looking for Ms. Yvette. Have you seen her?" Since Master Bentham had just dropped off Abel in Harvest City, directly coming from the blacksmith shop, Abel was still wearing gray cotton overalls. It was stained with traces of burnt fabric and sparks from the master blacksmith examination. Alongside with Abel's young age, He looked as if he was just another normal civilian. Surprisingly, the male shop assistant did not discriminate against Abel since he saw that Abel had arrived on a horse carriage. No matter how Abel looked or who he may be, the shop assistant knew that anyone who arrives on a horse carriage was probably someone who he couldn't afford to offend, else he could risk losing his job. Therefore, the shop assistant politely assisted Abel to wait at the chairs in the reception hall. Before the waiter left, he gave Abel a cup of coffee, then promptly went upstairs to find Yvette. Suddenly, a shrill voice came out from somewhere. "Who do you think you are? How could a peasant like you sit down at a boutique shop? Are you here for the free coffee? Is that it?" Abel looked around hesitantly for a few moments before finding out that it was himself who was being called a peasant. Abel had already accustomed to his identity in this world. Ever since he came here, no one has ever made such an insult to him. He looked at the man with a frown on his face and spoke to the man directly. The man who called Abel a peasant was a skinny 30-years-old man with a face as dry as the desert. He was wearing a black dress like a stick in his body, with a posture like a bent shrimp. "Are you talking about me?" Abel questioned the man in an unimpressed and dissatisfied tone. "Nice try. In pretending to be someone you will never be." The man then glanced over towards Abel. He then laughed at Abel as he saw the blacksmith medal that he, not even once, had seen in his whole life. "If you're going to bring a blacksmith medal, at least bring one that looks real, not some shady fake pieces like these." "Guards, get this guy out of here," the man said with a mocking tone. "Sir, please exit the store," said the two guards as they approached Abel. "If Edmund's boutique shop doesn't give me what I'm looking for, I will forward this matter to the noble tribunal for my rights and authority to be here," said Abel as he took out a white unicorn coat of arms from one of the pockets. He immediately displayed it in front of the guards. When the two guards saw the coat of arms from Abel's hand, they frantically ran away in panic. The man who doubted Abel suddenly became pale and shocked. No one in this world dared to fake the coat of arms. This was because that faking the coat of arms was a sin, and it would often lead to a death penalty. Moreover, the coat of arms represented the status of a noble. Only the noble and his successors would have had the rights and eligibility to use their family coat of arms. The noble arbitration court was built to protect the noble's rights. When the noble's dignity was violated, the noble arbitration court would step in and defend the noble's legitimate rights. This may sound a civilized thing to do, but the noble arbitration court and their course of action were extremely cruel. According to past events, every time a noble arbitral tribunal was dispatched for violating and insulting the dignity of these high-class noble, someone was bound to be burned to death. "What's the matter?" Yvette hurried down the stairs at a brisk pace and saw the situation and what was happening. When two guards saw her, they slowly walked back with their bodies shrinking backward. Yvette quickly glanced over and saw Abel's clothes. She quickly realized the situation and she spoke apologetically. "Hello. I apologize on behalf of Edmund's auction house for all the inconvenience caused to you." At the same moment, Yvette's eyes froze as she witnessed the medal on Abel's chest. "Are you a master, Abel?" "The 36th blacksmith to pass the blacksmith master rating," said Yvette with an astonished and shocked tone. "Ms. Yvette, you are correct. I am Abel." "I didn't realize that the news would go around so fast." Abel lamented on how fast the news has spread. Rumors were just as widespread as it was on Earth. "Master Abel, we have just received word from headquarters that you have passed the assessment at the Harvest City Blacksmith Guild. Headquarters has specifically requested that our division follow closely onto you." Yvette then quickly glanced over to the man who doubted Abe and followed up with an apology to Abel. "Our boutique shop will give you an account of your injustice." When the tall and thin man heard what Yvette had said, he suddenly became paralyzed on the ground. These words from Yvette's had sealed his fate, but at the same time, he knew how insignificant his fate is in the eyes of others. Abel had a special intention when he wore his blacksmith master medal to Edmund's boutique shop. This was because he wanted to auction his sword of 1,000 skills and also a deluxe version of a fire magical sword of 100 skills at Edmund's boutique shop in this identity. By doing so, not only it was easier to sell the swords, but it could also attract more publicity to this auction. therefore maximizing the value of these weapons. Ms. Yvette, I've brought some of the forged weapons that I've made, and I'd like Edmund's boutique shop to help me put it up for auction. When Yvette heard what Abel had said, her eyes lit up and suddenly shined. This was a wonderful opportunity for her to be putting up the newly titled Master Blacksmith's weapons for sale at Edmund's auction house. As Yvette was in charge of this matter, this could well be an immense achievement for her, and it would boost her future career and promotion tremendously. Thank you for your trust in Edmund's boutique shop, and we will sell your work at the highest standards within our auction, said Yvette excitedly. Abel made a proposition. On one condition only, these weapons will not be auctioned at Harvest City. At first, Yvette was confused by Abel's proposition, but then she immediately understood his reasonings. This was because there was a new weapon shop called Harry's Weapon Shop in the same town, and Abel's last name was Harry as well. Therefore, Abel must not want people to misunderstood that all the weapons in that store were also owned by his family. No problem, Master Abel. To Yvette, it didn't matter where she sold the weapons. As long as she was in charge of the selling, she would have been able to take all the credits regardlessly. As the guards unloaded some of the weapons from Abel's carriage at the front door, Abel pointed to the 7 swords of 1,000 skills and said, "These are just the weapons I made during my training. They're just ordinary weapons of 100 skills." He then pointed towards the deluxe version of Fire Magical Sword and said, "This variant was made with the use of dwarf technology. After some decorations, I named it the deluxe version of Fire Magic Sword of 1,000 Skills." Wait, is this a magical weapon? Added Novel Benedette. Of course, Yvette had heard of magical weapons before. That being said, though, they were classified as extremely rare and high-end weapons. Even the headquarters of the Edmund boutique store could rarely see one. Curiously, Yvette drew the large sword from its sheath, but the sword was too heavy for a lady. So she held the large sword with both her hands and attempted to place it on the counter for a closer inspection. Suddenly, Abel's heart skipped a beat as he what Yvette was about to do. He quickly shouted, "Be careful!" But it was too late. The fire magical sword had slipped from Yvette's hand. The moment that the body of the sword touched the floor, a red light flashed from the body of the sword. Dong! The sword had hit the ground. In that split second, the area where the sword was dropped had become fully blackened, and the atmosphere of the boutique shop was filled with a burnt smell. Abel quickly picked up the sword from the ground and placed it back into the sheath. Yvette was in complete shock and frightened by what had just happened. The sword would have put a huge hole on the counter if it was directly placed there, let alone thinking of the consequences burning down such an expensive counter. Yvette could not help but pat herself on the chest. At the same time, she had now truly experienced how terrifying the fire magical power of this sword was. She couldn't imagine what would be the consequence if this sword was used to attack people. "Master Abel, I will only charge a commission of 2% of the total value of your weapons." This was the lowest commission that Yvette could have offered to anyone, and she offered it to Abel for thanking him earlier for his warning. "Thank you, Ms. Yvette." Abel had understood all the details and procedures of the auction, and thankful for Yvette's kind intentions. Then, Yvette signed a contract with Abel. Therefore, the 7 swords of 100 skills and the deluxe version of a fire magic sword of 100 skills were left at Edmund's boutique shop for auction. Afterward, Abel went to Harry's weapons shop and handed 2 more swords of 100 skill to the manager. The manager did not ask any questions, as he was an experienced businessman. Seeing that the 2 hours were already up, Abel called the driver and headed back to the blacksmith shop to pick up Master Bentham and go back to the castle. 30 minutes had passed. The two were well on their way, now going back to the castle. During the journey, Abel and Master Bentham were exchanging knowledge in their forging experiences with one another. But for most parts, Master Bentham was mainly teaching and mentoring Abel. Although Abel was a quick learner and had already become a blacksmith master, he was nowhere near as experienced as Master Bentham. While they were chatting away, Abel suddenly felt that the carriage had come to a stop. So, he then lifted the curtain of the horse carriage and asked the driver, "What's wrong?" Added Novel Benedette. The cart driver was in shock as he spoke with a sense of astonishment. Something seems odd with the village ahead. Maybe something had happened. Abel then spoke directly to Master Bentham. "Master, you stay in the carriage while I go take a look at what's going on." Master Bentham laughed and said, "I'm a level 5 fighter myself. You don't need to worry about me." For someone who was only a level 5 fighter like Master Bentham, Abel was extremely skeptical about his capacity to fight. Even the Knight of Martial himself had to keep training every single day to maintain his fighting ability. As for Master Bentham, Abel had never seen him practicing his fighting skills a single time, ever since the day they met. But Abel did not insist on Master Bentham staying. As the two got out of the carriage, they immediately saw the distant village rising in clouds of black smoke. "I'll go ahead and take a look." As Abel pulled out the great ice magical sword that had been forged during the Blacksmith Union evaluation from the trunk of the carriage. The sword was not yet decorated, so it looked ugly, but it certainly would not affect its defensive capabilities and functions. "Be careful," Master Bentham warned. Abel waved his hand, signaling that he understood Bentham's goodwill, and promptly walked towards the village. The closer he got to the village, the more Abel sensed that something was wrong. It wasn't just a small fire, it was the entire village and its houses being burnt down. When Abel arrived at the village, he was in shock for what he had just witnessed. The ground of the village was littered with dead bodies of the innocent villagers. Not only that, but some of the dead bodies were mutilated. It seemed as though they had been bitten by an animal of some sort. The most disturbing thing to Abel was the sight of the multiple corpses of children. These bodies were scattered in almost all parts of the village. It was obvious that what happened here was an unjust slaughter. Only a group that had absolute power could have planned a massacre like this. In Abel's knowledge of this world's history, it would be extremely rare to see the slaughtering of innocent civilians, even if it's an invasion of another country. As Abel walked around the village, there was not a single survivor. It seemed that the killers were highly trained and experienced. They might even possess special abilities. The places where the people hid had been completely abolished, and those who had hidden were killed without mercy. Abel had never felt so anxious. It was almost indescribable to him. Even though this area was not a part of his family's territory, as a human being, he couldn't help but felt a sense of sympathetic sadness and sorrowfulness for the victims of this massacre. When Abel came to this world, he thought he saw a peaceful image. Even though he had been attacked by people before, he thought that no world could be perfect. There would always be criminals out there. However, what he had witnessed today was the first time something has shocked him to his soul. Maybe this world was not as peaceful as he had imagined. People were being slaughtered in their own home. What would have happened if that was his own family? What if it was the Bennett family? As Abel didn't return for a long period of time, Bentham was starting to get worried. He quickly hurried to the village. When he saw the scene of the massacre and the bodies, he was also in a great deal of shock. God, what happened? Master Bentham quickly went over to the bodies of the victims and examined it carefully. "Orcs," he said grimly. "It was the orcs." Master Bentham then pointed towards the wounds of the corpses and said, "These were the bite marks of wolves. No wonder there were recent reports of wolf riders being seen around here." The wolf riders were the dominant unit of the Orc Empire's military, which were mostly trained by the werewolves and wirgins. The wolf rider troops were extremely strong when it came to their speed, agility, flexibility, and their stance of direction. All these characteristics made the wolf cavalry one of the strongest armies here in mainland. Not only were they strong, but they were also extremely adaptable to even the toughest environment. During long battles, they feed off from the slain enemies, allowing them for maximum efficiencies in continuing their battles. "We better go back immediately. The Knight of Martial needs to know about this." Suddenly, something occurred to Master Bentham. He realized that there must be still some werewolves nearby, and with the speed of these werewolves, all the villages and castles nearby around here would be in great danger. Abel and Master Bentham quickly returned to their carriage and hurried back towards Harry's castle, with the driver driving as fast as he can. Simon was a war gen, or rather, a wolf rider in the wolf cavalry. His wife was a female wolf named Blackwind. Simon's home was in a barren plain that had experienced a great deal of poverty. His home had around 200 acres of land, and he had 9 brothers and sisters. As Simon was the second child of the family, their 200 acres of land not providing enough source of food for their entire family's need. So his parents decided to use up the majority of their resources on Simon, as he had the potential of becoming a member of the Wolf Riders. But by doing so, this meant that all his brothers and sisters would starve. In order to gain more land for his family, Simon made up his mind. He would participate in the trial of death. In the past, every participant who could survive the trial of death would be rewarded with a piece of land. Besides that, most of them could often be brought back a large number of gold coins and gems, which were more than enough to buy a whole lot of land. Simon tried his best, not thinking about the consequences of the annual trial death. He tried not to remind himself of a large number of people who would not make it back alive. He only wished to be one of the survivors. Simon felt that he was out of luck the other night when he was passing through the Budapest Mountains. He allocated his wife, Black Wind, to rest a shed within the barracks. There were a lot of other male wolves in the shed. One of them had sexual interaction with his wife. After riding the flying beast through the Budapest Mountains, the small group of cavalry troops, which consisted of 10 members, set off and began their journey. Everything was going smoothly as they progressed forward. They avoided towns and only attacked small villages. Although the reward from raiding these small villages weren't massive, these successive raids on the small villages allowed Simon to gain a significant amount of confidence throughout his journey. But one day, Simon found out that his wife was pregnant. Wolves were extremely loyal creatures. Their loyalty to their master was unprecedented among all animals. When a baby wolf was born, the first creature it sees would ultimately become its master. Normally, the pregnancy of a wolf was a very happy event and deserved to be celebrated. Whether if it was to give his brother the right to claim his title as the master, or to give up the privilege of being a master in exchange for a large number of resources, it was just a beautiful thing within the wolves' culture. But since this was a world where humans lived, Simon would have to fight here with the current situation on hand. A pregnant wolf meant that it would greatly affect Simon's ability to use his power during the trial. Even though the villagers in the previous siege did not resist their attack, but the gore and excessive violence of their attacks, it gave Black Wind a lot of damage during her pregnancy. This meant that she was unable to keep up with the squad, and the other wolf cavalry team members weren't willing to put themselves at risk for Simon's problems. The only reason that the wolves are able to launch multiple attacks in different villages was because of their speed. The speed of the wolf cavalry determined their fate during the trial of death. Simon stayed behind while the others left. He was the only one that stayed with his wife. He didn't dare to enter towards the open. The only thing he could have done was to hide in the forest and wait for Black Wind to give birth. Every day Simon was hunting in the jungle, and every time he went out and hunt, there was just enough food for him and his partner to eat and survive. He often thought to himself, when would he be able to own land like these, to have more food than he could ever eat? The wealth of humans in this world often attracted countless orcs like Simon himself. They all have one common goal: grab it and occupy it. Every day, Simon carved a line on a tree to count off the days. All he wanted now was to spend his remaining 2 months safely in this jungle. Then, he could travel back to Meetup Zone to return home to his orc empire. Uncle Marshall, when I was on my way back from Harvest City, I witnessed a village that was attacked by the orcs. It was located between the castle and Harvest City. When Knight Marshall heard about this affair, he immediately notified his steward Lindsay. Lindsay, ring the alarm bell now and get all the villagers from all of our territories to enter the castle for shelter now. When they are inside, make sure you verify their identity as well. Yes, my lord, Lindsay quickly said and promptly hurried out. Uncle Marshall, I prepared a present for you. I originally intended to give this present to you later for your birthday. But with the current circumstances we have on our hands, I think you should have it now, so that it could increase your strength. Abel then brought out a deluxe version of an ice magic sword of 100 skills directly from his bag. When they returned to the castle, Abel went into the operations room and took out another piece of the deluxe ice magic sword of 100 skills, which was also originally prepared for Marshall's birthday. However, he decided to give the deluxe version of the ice magic sword of 100 skills directly to Knight Marshall right now. This was a crucial move for Abel since increasing their fighting strength was what mattered the most right now. Once again, Abel took out another piece of the deluxe version of the ice magic sword of 100 skills. There wasn't much time left to lose, so Abel also handed it over into the hands of Knight Marshall. A magic sword. The Knight Marshall pulled out the sword as he gently touched the sword with touched at his fingers. He then hastily shook off the frost on his hand and said excitedly, "Wow, this is a magic ice sword. That's the good stuff." He then turned around and looked undeviatingly at Abel and stated, "Bentham had been researching the forging process of magic weapons for a long time. Looks like his hard work has finally paid off. This was my gift to you. How could you say that it was forged for Master Bentham?" Abel felt a sense of speechlessness to see that the gift that he made was being said to be made by someone else's. Knight Marshall couldn't believe it. He was speechless for a while. "Abel, you made this sword?" Knight Marshall questioned him with a sense of disbelief. Abel remained in silence. He then pointed directly to his own master blacksmith's medal on his chest. It was then that Knight Marshall has finally just realized that Abel had an extra medal carried on him. "You're a master blacksmith?" After hearing what Abel said, Knight Marshall was suddenly in doubt of the entire world and his whole existence. Since when could a 13-year-old novice like you can become a master blacksmith? "The trip that I took to Harvest City was for evaluating the weapons I've made," Abel said. Was this true? Knight Marshall's facial expression immediately shifted from being astonished to being wildly excited. He then began to laugh frantically in joy. "Huh. Ha, blah, ha. We have a master blacksmith here in our own home. Hey, Abel, I want the best magic armor, the strongest magic shield, a magic knight firearm. Oh, I almost forgot. I also want a magical bow, too." Abel looked at the already overly enthusiastic Knight Marshall. He headed out of the room without even bothering to look back. According to what Knight Marshall had requested, it would have required all the best blacksmiths in the Blacksmith Union. All for a silly dream such as this. All of a sudden, the bell rang heavily. There were 20 soldiers wearing leather armors and equipped with long guns. They rode their horses as they gathered in front of the castle. The Knight Marshall immediately changed into his imitation blazing sun armor as he jumped onto his personal white warhorse. His horse was way more powerful than any other ordinary warhorses. It was tall and equipped with the deluxe edition of the Sword of 100 Skills, Abel's gift. On his hand, he was carrying a knight's rifle as he stood in front of his squad of cavalry soldiers preparing to give a speech. Those filthy orcs had appeared again. "My soldiers, let's get our weapons ready. Together we will defend our homeland from these orcs." After hearing Knight Marshall's motivating address, the soldiers were all aroused and were all ready to go into battle to fight bravely. If anyone managed to slay an orc himself, it would be considered an outstanding military service. In the past, the only way to achieve an outstanding military service was to serve as a guard in Miracle City. Now, this opportunity was everywhere. To Abel, he thought the soldiers at Harry's castle were brave and steadfast. An entire platoon of 20 horses, along with the costs of training for these soldiers. Only the wealthy and powerful people like Bentham's masters could have afforded such a group of well-trained elite soldiers. At the Bennett Castle, a sweaty messenger quickly approached the Knight Bennett and handed him a parcel. He quickly told the butler to give a small reward to compensate the messenger as he returned immediately back to his room with the parcel. When the Knight Bennett opened the package, he spotted a large sword and 2 enclosed letters. One of the letters was from Knight Marshall, informing him about the recent attacks that occurred on the villages, as well as to raise their awareness and to scout out for any future orc attacks that may occur. The other letter was from Abel, which read, "Your birthday present came early." When Knight Bennett pulled out a large sword from his package, he immediately recognized that something was different about this sword. The value of the sword he had just pulled out was immeasurable. When he found out that the sword was an ice magical sword, the Knight of Bennett Immediate felt a heart full of sentiment. Even though Abel had become the adopted son of someone else, Abel was still willing to spend a large amount to purchase an ice magical sword as a present for the Knight of Bennett to protect himself after he realized the orcs were now roaming around. These days, the Knight Bennett was already filled with regrets for letting Abel get adopted. If had realized that Abel had forged this sword himself, who knows how much more regretful could he get? When Abel traveled to the blacksmith store earlier today, everyone who saw him, including his apprentices, was all gazing at him differently. They all seemed to obtain a sense of respect for Abel. People were now addressing him as Master Abel, but he seemed to be stressed whenever he heard people calling him by the title of Master. However, Abel was no longer an undistinguished ordinary blacksmith. He was now a blacksmith master, which required him to be less humble and modest about his identity, as he was now representing an entire community, the highest of the blacksmith union. When Abel went back into the store, he went into his dedicated operations room and locked himself inside. Ever since he started forging weapons, he always had a low requirement for his equipment. Although he could forge a sword of 100 skills, he had never truly forged a customized weapon for himself. The only sword that he had with him was the magic ice sword, which was forged during the blacksmith examination. Why didn't Abel forge weapons for himself? Firstly, Abel himself was not in any particular danger back then. He had never thought that it would be in use, and it would be wasteful to leave it there to rust. Secondly, his body was growing speedily due to puberty. This meant that the equipment that he made now would be wasted, as the equipment that he crafted would not be able to fit him as he grew even 1 year older. However, in the current situation, the chances of a battle happening were extremely likely. So Abel finally decided to forge a few pieces of protective gear, just in case. By doing so, the new equipment would greatly enhance Abel's chance of remaining alive. The upcoming battle looked as though it would determine the life and death of Abel and everyone he knew. Firstly, Abel had to experiment a little bit with his current concept. He then wore some very thick gloves and placed a ceramic bottle into the furnace. After it was burning for a while, he took out the ceramic bottle with iron clamps, then directly threw a bucket of iced water at it. Almost at the same time, Abel stuffed the ceramic bottle in the Horadric Cube and pressed start. Although Abel saw that the ceramic bottle had entered inside the Horadric Cube, there was not a change ever since Abel took it out of the furnace. After remaining silent in deep thought, suddenly Abel realized that the body of the ceramic bottle seemed to have some cracks in them. As soon as Abel moved a single heartbeat, the ceramic bottle appeared on his hands. At the same time, he slammed the ceramic bottle into a pile of debris, and as it fell to the ground, everything was shattered to pieces. It worked. Abel rejoiced and immediately felt a sense of relief and satisfaction in his heart. Now, Abel had to forge a piece of a large magic sword. The current pace he had right now was considered very quick already. Normally, it would take around 5 hours on average to forge a magic sword. He was fast enough now to take 5 hours to make a big magic sword. With the magic sword now in the process of being forged, Abel intentionally wanted to write a few runes differently. He added a lot of useless strokes connecting in the most complicated way. During the final step, when he was leading the magical power of the blue gem to the center of the runes, the moment before the white light flashed, he shoved the sword into the Horadric Cube. With the leftover time, Abel worked extremely hard to create an oversized shield of 100 skills. The shield was as thick as 30 centimeters. If Abel wasn't a level 5 knight, he wouldn't even be able to lift this gigantic shield. Abel then took the failed magic ice sword that he just made from the Horadric Cube. This time Abel had learned his lesson. The moment he took out the sword, he threw it outside, and he counted slowly 1, 2, 3 in his head. When Abel counted to 3, he heard a loud bang outside the shield, followed by a chaotic noise of ding, ding, dong, dong. It sounded like the shield being struck by 1,000 spears. After the noise had stopped, Abel peeked his head from the back of the shield. The explosion was much larger this time. The large stone wall was pierced with countless scattered pieces. Some even seemed to have made a small hole on the wall. When Abel saw his shield, he was so deeply shocked that his entire body felt like they were drenched in cold sweat. There were holes everywhere on his shield, and the holes looked as if they were hit by bullets. It was even deep enough to put a finger through. At it novel Benedet. If Abel wasn't holding an extra thick shield, he might have been heavily wounded from the blast of the sword. Abel couldn't believe that by adding a few rune circuits, the effect of the explosion would have increased by such a significant amount. What would have happened if a sword like this were thrown in the middle of a crowd? Abel thought to himself. Abel could only imagine the catastrophic accidents it would have caused. No one could have survived a blast that strong. Of course, such a highly dangerous weapon had to be stored in the Horadric Cube, so a weapon like this could only be Abel's secret weapon. The Horadric Cube was the most important secret of Abel. His success was entirely aided with the assistance. Therefore, Abel would not let anyone who had a glimpse of it remain alive. In the evening, Abel did not return to the castle to rest. He stayed up the entire night to forge 3 pieces of exploding swords to be stored within the Horadric Cube. In the meantime, Abel had also learned self-defense and how to properly protect himself. Abel suddenly thought about the grenades in the original Old World. The explosion that had just occurred was similar to the explosion of grenades. According to what Abel learned from the era of the explosion, the safest place to survive after a grenade exploded would be on the ground, even though there would be shockwaves. Based on the original world's concept of the tank cannon-bound shells, Abel built a much smaller shield that could be hung around the waist. During the explosion, the person could reduce the number of damage in an explosion by lying on the ground, and then using the small shield to bounce off the pieces of debris at different oblique angles. Abel returned to the castle the next morning. After he had breakfast and rested for 2 hours, he returned to his private operation room in the Blacksmith's Guild. For the trillionth time, Abel was a bodybuilding trainer in his previous life. He was used to going hiking with his friends in the wild, which made him have a lot of experience in hunting. This time, Abel wanted to make a giant bear trap according to his memories. As Master Bentham suggested, the wolf riders were very fast and flexible. They would often implement a hit-and-run strategy during battle. If they didn't have a large number of soldiers to surround them, it would be very difficult to annihilate them. However, things would be completely different if we could make a large bear trap. If a wolf rider stepped on it, it would at the very least injure their leg. This could hugely reduce their speed, therefore they will no longer be a threat. The beasts and humans of this world were both much stronger than the beasts and humans in the previous incarnation of Earth. Thus, Abel thought that he needed something special to stop these wolf riders. The components of the gigantic bear trap consisted of a large compression spring, 2 charm clamps, a clamp trigger, a button, and a chain. At it novel Benedet. After the compression spring was flattened with force, it was gently held secured with the clamp trigger. If someone stepped on it, the 2 sharp clamps would be released instantaneously, catching the prey with a tremendous amount of rebound force. Since the 2 sharp clamps were not fully enclosed yet, the more the prey struggled, the tighter the grip would be. It would be easy to imagine if the mount wolf of a wolf rider was caught by this gigantic bear trap. With the speed of the wolf rider, the mount wolf would be in excruciating amounts of pain. Therefore, the wolf rider would most likely be shaken off by the mount wolf. This world did not have such a large bear trap. Therefore, the placement of the traps should not attract too much attention to the orcs, especially if we add some more camouflage to it. The process of making the trap was simple. The only trouble was the compression spring. According to Abel's memory, the steel used in the spring must require a high carbon content to maintain the steel's elasticity. Abel practiced by forging a rough model with 100 skills. After several attempts of carbizing, a lot of small samples were made according to different carbizing ratios. After testing, he decided on the best sample, and the production process was finally determined. Then, Abel began mass production. After he made 10 compression springs, there were still a lot of materials left. He then made several large spiral springs which could be used as shock absorbers when he decided to upgrade the carriage in the future. Abel did not make any other accessories of the gigantic bear trap him since that would take too much time. The compression springs were the component that mattered the most. The other parts could let other blacksmiths in the blacksmith shop take care of it. Abel called his senior, Gordon, who gave him a drawn blueprint and dimensions of the bear trap's other components, and requested it to be forged in 2 days. Gordon did not have a problem with the request, since he ordered a few of the most capable blacksmiths to work extra hours to complete it as soon as possible. Early next morning, when Abel arrived at the blacksmith shop, Gordon told Abel with a pair of tired red eyes, "Master Abel, all the parts are made according to your requirements, and they are placed in your operation room." Abel was very surprised. He thought that it would have taken at least 2 days, but it was finished in 1 night. Looking at the tired red eyes of Gordon, he could not help but say, "Why didn't you sleep last night? I don't need these parts in a rush." Since the blacksmiths heard that it was your command, they refused to delay it and worked overnight. Gordon did not mention himself. He only gave the credit to the other blacksmiths who was standing in front of Abel. "Next time, when I forge a sword of 100 skill, the blacksmiths, and you can watch on the side. Now, go to rest," Abel said with a smile. "Thank you, Master Abel. I will let them know." Gordon thanked Abel and ran off. When Abel walked into the operation room, he saw a pile of accessories placed on the ground. It has been divided into 10 parts. From these details alone, it was enough to show that Gordon was a very attentive person. It took some effort to assemble such large bear traps, but Abel had always been a tough person. In half an hour, 10 large traps were fully assembled. 2 horses were brought in, and each of them was strapped with 5 large traps. After it was secured, Abel waved a hand, signaling that they were ready to go. Behind Harry Castle was a forest. Since Abel has been busy ever since he settled here, he never had the chance to explore this forest. He has heard that there were large beasts roaming around in there. Therefore, Abel decided this would be the place to test out his giant bear trap. Although the castle has now begun to be on guard, when Abel left the castle with the 2 horses, no guard dared to ask anything. Abel's current status was completely different from that when he first arrived. Everyone knew that Abel has now become a blacksmith's master. In this world, the title of master could be attained by the elites of that particular profession. Therefore, they would be respected no matter where they go in the Holy Continent. It was the sunniest part of the afternoon. The sun was shining through the gaps of the trees, scattering patches of lights over the fallen leaves on the ground. It made a dull, crunching sound as Abel continued to walk. The horses were not very fond of the forest environment either, as their nose began to make snorting sounds. After he walked for about half an hour, Abel felt that he had arrived at the center of the forest. Although he did not see a single large beast along the way, he found a large pile of beast dung, which suggested there must be large beasts around here. The place was deserted. The last sign of civilization had already disappeared 10 minutes ago. Abel immediately knew this was the perfect place to put the bear trap since the trap was so powerful it could not be placed anywhere close to humans. Abel squatted down to look for a beast's route on the ground. Beasts would always like to travel on the same route, and they would often leave some footprints behind. Therefore, experienced hunters would always know where the best place to set their traps. Although Abel didn't have as much experience, he was still trained in this aspect. So after careful observation, he found a beast route. He immediately took out 2 gigantic bear traps from the horses. Then, he opened the clamps by force and secured the trigger. There were many techniques when it came to the placements of bear traps. You had to inspect the beast's route properly in order to speculate the steps they would take. Even if the beast could dodge the first bear trap, it would not be able to escape the second one. After the installation, Abel made an arrow marking on a tree. This mark was a reminder of where Abel had placed the trap and would make sure he wouldn't step in it himself. However, since there were arrows on the marking pointing towards different directions, it also allowed Abel to less likely get lost in the forest. Abel continued to move forward. Every 10 minutes, he would find a place to put the bear trap. Slowly, he walked for more than an hour, and all the large traps were placed. The sky began to get dark. Abel was packing up his things, preparing to go back to the castle. There were still 2 hours before the sky was completely darkened. Until then, he could still see his way back. At that moment, suddenly he heard a painful, yet angry scream from the distance. A beast must have fallen for his gigantic bear trap. Only a beast could have made a noise in this forest. Abel strapped his horse next to a tree and rushed in the direction of the sound. As Abel was running, he was constantly observing the surrounding environment and the marking he made. It would be hilarious if he had fell for his own trap. After running for 10 minutes, Abel found the marking that he made. He slowed down and walked gently into the trap. Although the sharp clamps had been triggered, there was no prey to be found anywhere. Abel squatted down and touched sharp teeth of the clamp with his hands. There was blood. What triggered the trap might not be a beast after all. Although Abel doesn't know what else could have triggered it, a beast definitely would not have the intelligence to free itself from it, especially without the help of a human hand. If the beast was very powerful, at most, it would just destroy the trap, not leaving it enclosed like this. Could it be human? Abel shook his head. The voice he had just heard was clearly not human. That, he could be certain of. Not far from where the gigantic bear trap was placed, Abel spotted even more bloodstains on the ground. As he resumed his search following the directions of the blood trails, he suddenly stumbled across another spot of bloodstains which wasn't too far from the original directions that he had come from. Abel continued to follow the blood trail. From the looks of it, the prey didn't seem to be injured badly. It was probably just a leg. However, as he continued, he thought that maybe the wound on the prey's leg might be quite serious since it bled continuously. Abel's hunting instinct and experience in his previous life had taught him that when prey was injured, they instinctively sought the most secure and safe place for themselves to recover from the injury. This would probably be the case with this prey as well. After following the blood trail for around 30 minutes, Abel suddenly saw lights from a fire in front of him. Abel felt confused and found it strange. Humans would never have survived or habited in a place like this. As he slowly approached the fire, Abel saw in the distance a creature that he had never seen before treating its own leg wounds. The creature had a head that looked like a wolf, 2 canine teeth protruding from the outside, alongside with a body that resembled a human. However, it had a slightly more curved back with a height of around a little over 2 meters. Next to the creature was a huge, mysterious wolf resting on the ground. The belly of the wolf seemed to be so large that it looked as if it was pregnant. Abel was now certain that the creature in front of him was the wolf troopers that attacked the village that he saw earlier, and the wolf that was resting near must be the legendary Mount Wolf. Had it novel been at? Once again, Simon was out of luck. He hid in the jungle, away from the humans. Every day, he hunted for food to keep himself and the Mount Wolf well fed. One day, he went out to hunt just like any other ordinary days. He had already familiarized himself with the environment during these days. Therefore, he had lowered his awareness when moving around the forest. It was an everyday routine for him. During his hunt, he went onto a route that he was extremely familiar with. It was the route that he had took many times, and it was the safest road to him. But suddenly, he stepped on something strange. It looked to be 2 giant elephant's teeth that clamped through his legs. The pain that he suffered when he stepped onto the trap made him furious. It was so painful that he screamed repeatedly. He didn't know what it was, but he was certain that it belonged to the humans. After a while, he realized that even though the trap looked scary, it wasn't particularly painful and only injured him a tiny bit. It didn't even break the bones of his leg. It was just a sharp serrated tooth that tore his skins with the muscle of his lower legs. Most importantly, the trap was easy to break, too. All he did was to gather up all his strength and pry it open with his hands. However, his injured legs still needed to be treated. All the precious medical supplies were left back in his camp. Therefore, all he could now was to limp back slowly to his camp so that he could treat his wound. As Simon treated his wound, he thought to himself, there have been sightings of humans around this area, and it was no longer safe to stay here. It looked like they may have to move to another area. With Simon's Mount Wolf Blackwind having to give birth in these upcoming few days, the best time to move away would be tomorrow. To Simon, the quicker they moved, the better. With the birth of a small Mount Wolf, they will lose all their mobility. All of a sudden, Simon's nose picked up a different scent in the air. It was the scent of humans, Simon then ferociously stood up with a worried facial expression on his face and looked around carefully to scan for any danger. Abel observed with extreme caution as the worgen got up and peeked around. Suddenly, Abel realized the worgen must have sensed his presence from a distance. As a worgen, Simon had an extremely strong and terrifying sense of smell. The moment he picked up the scent of Abel, Simon knew that this human was the one who injured him. These inferior humans would need to use such despicable methods to injure him. He was ready to do anything he could to find the bastard who did this and wipe him off the surface of the earth. When Abel realized that he was spotted by the worgen was already dashing directly towards his direction from afar. At that moment, Abel knew he was in big trouble. From the vigorous look of this worgen, it at least possessed the fighting ability of a novice knight, which to say this wolf rider was at least level 6. While Abel was only a rank 5 novice knight, he was only one rank away from being in rank 6. However, the probation between knights that were level 1 to 5 only had one combat chi force. The power of the force was determined through level-based, level 1 being the weakest while level 5 being the strongest. However, their combat chi was only available to fire once at a time, since novice knights did not have a core to generation more combat chi. Therefore, once they used up all their chi in their meridian, it would require at least a few days for them to recover before using it again. The combat chi was like an amplifier for power. If a professional could produce around 500 pounds of force, his combat chi would be capable of doubling that power to 1,000 pounds. For a level 6 professional, they can use the combat chi multiple times, thus multiplying their attacking strength. However, level 5 or below only has one shot to double their strength. Therefore, their difference in strength could not be matched no matter how good the weapons and accessories are. If Abel used his large sword against Simon the worgen, the only outcome would be that Abel being excluded by the force of the sword, while Simon only slowed down a bit by the ice magic of the sword. When Abel thought about it, he suddenly had an idea. He wasn't going to fight the worgen. Since he saw the injury on the worgen's legs, maybe he could have a chance to escape. When Simon saw that the man, not only was he unwilling to engage in combat, but was turning around and running away, he thought to himself, what a coward that human was. With little regard to his injury, Simon began to make a chase after Abel. Originally, Abel thought that since the worgen's leg was injured, he surely would have run faster than the worgen. However, the wagon was still the fastest predator in the Holy Continent. Ever since Simon began to chase after Abel, he had been catching up closer and closer to his speed at every second. Abel estimated his current distance to the worgen. If he used the exploding sword with a 3-second wait time, he could cause severe damage or even kill the worgen. However, with all these forests nearby, with the speed of the wagon, it could use these trees as cover and dodge the majority blast. The exploding sword only had one attack. The best chance for Abel would have been when the worgen was unprepared for his attack. However, if the first attempt was unsuccessful, the second attempt would be even less likely to succeed as the worgen would have raised his awareness. Abel took out a crossbow, which was already loaded with an arrow. He immediately looked back and aimed at the head of the worgen and fired. The worgen had extremely precise reaction time. He instantly dodged the arrow. The worgen was now even closer. Abel realized he didn't have any time left to reload his crossbow, so he made a quick decision. Abel threw his crossbow directly at the worgen, who was rapidly catching up to him. The worgen's paws caught the crossbow in the air, and within seconds, the crossbow became a pile of trash on the ground. With not much time left, Abel lastly took out the crossbow made by the dwarf. However, he only got the chance to fire it once before it became useless again. With no more ranged weapons equipped with Abel, the only option now was to use the trees to distance himself from the worgen. Abel kept changing directions. By doing so, he could slowly keep his current distance against the worgen. As Abel sprinted, Abel quickly caught a glimpse of a familiar sign with the corner of his eyes. He realized that it was the trap he had set earlier. Simon became more and more frantic. The blood of the orcs seemed to boil within him. He gave a great shout, and his muscles were immediately all ferociously tensed. It even transformed him from 2 meters large into 2.5 meters. Simon's speed seemed to change significantly too. Abel suddenly felt the worgen's breathing behind him. When he looked at the sign again, he was already at his trap that he set earlier. He lunged forward as he held his ground between the 2 traps that were placed on the ground. The front hand of the trap flipped, which turned over the second trap. This allowed Abel to escape the attack from the worgen claw from behind. The worgen screamed with a cry of OW. Simon's legs were caught again. As he ran, the chain of the gigantic trap was tied to the tree pole at one end, and the strong pulling force caused Simon to fall onto the ground. Abel saw the worgen lying down on the ground, and before the worgen's hand could pull open the clamp, Abel had pulled out an exploding sword from the Horadric Cube. Before the white light flashing in the explosion of the sword, Abel was already on the ground taking cover, and the light shield at the waist was tilted in front of him to protect him from the explosion. Simon saw a bright, shining white sword flying towards him. It was not moving very fast, which surprised him, but at the same time, an instinctive sense of fear arose from the depths of his body. Then immediately the sword exploded. There was a loud bang, and Abel's shield jingled in front of him. When everything became quiet, he stood up and the trapped worgen was covered in blood. Particularly in the middle of its fear-filled eyes, a hole was gushing out blood. A piece of debris had directly struck the wagon on its head. Abel approached the worgen. The worgen, who was 2.5 meters in shape, had transformed back to 2 meters upon its death. Due to the transformation of the worgen earlier, the clothes made from the fur on its body have broken open and something was protruding outside. As Abel took out that something from the blood-smeared worgen, it was a sheepskin paper. On the paper was some kind of orc's text with a map and some strange piece of branding. On the brand was carved with a long curved horn and a lion's face. The lion looked to have more developed muscles of the body than a normal human, along with sharp claws on its hand followed by a pair of toe shoes. The lion was the god of the orcs. As Abel investigated further, he found that at the bottom of the brand, there was a star. If there were orcs here, they would have known the importance of this sign. These were special orc ability skill cards. Each sign was sealed with a powerful ability. Because most of the orcs had no written language, the orc gods used this method to preserve these skills, and the orcs learned their skills through these signs. The sign that Abel found had another star. This meant there's still another opportunity, the special, to learn the special orc ability. Even though it was not known where Simon had gotten the special orc sign, but the rarity of this orc sign was beyond doubt, even for ordinary orcs. Abel knew what an orc skill card was. He knew what it was, but the card had a power that was so strange that he had to take a closer look at it. For reasons he wasn't sure of, he was somehow attracted by it in ways that he couldn't describe. Abel decided to use his power of the will on the card. He closed his eyes for a bit and decided to focus all his senses on the mysterious force that was lingering by. As his conscience began to enter the card, he felt an energy that was similar to the one that his body produced. It was the power of one spirit. It was probably not a human spirit, though. Without asking for Abel's permission, this energy began to draw itself closer towards him. It was trying to synchronize with him. Abel didn't want to, but it was too late before he could switch off his power of the will state. Whilst trying to open his eyes, Abel realized that he had become a young war djinn himself. It kind of felt like a movie for him, except it was much more realistic than a movie. He had no control over his body, but everything he saw was very much in detail. The war djinn, Abel, walked to the front of a mounted wolf. It placed its hand on top of the beast's head, then uttered some very strange words from his mouth. It was not a language that Abel had learned about before, but bizarrely enough, he could understand every word of it. As devoted followers of the beastly gods, the Wurgens would often include words of praise in their vocabulary. They would also use weird consonants to match the words that they were saying, which allowed them to communicate their thoughts with the Mount Wolves, kind of like what Abel was seeing here. The war djinn could understand what the Mount Wolf was thinking, and so could the Mount Wolf to the war djinn. The war djinn would have sent a command to the Mount Wolf without having said anything, and the Mount Wolf would follow it after receiving it telepathically. After riding on a Mount Wolf for a while, the war djinn used its combat chi and gave it a full body massage. Things were looking very tranquil here, But the scene got cut off for some reason. Without being able to watch what happened next, Abel's mind was returned to his body. There was a star at the bottom of the skill card. As Abel switched off his power of the will state, it started fading away and eventually disappeared. The card, too, was destroyed after that. Abel was afraid of it exploding like his heavy sword, so he threw it away into the air before he got injured by it. Luckily, the card didn't explode. Instead, it just kind of fizzled out and ceased to exist. The skill card did a lot for Abel. Because of it, he learned how to speak the language of the orcs, as well as being able to use the mount enhancement technique on any rideable animal. Technically speaking, however, the card itself did not have the function to teach Abel another language. He only learned the orc's tongue because he was reading it with his power of the will state on, which synchronized his psyche to the young war djinn that he saw. Despite regional differences, the orcs spoke a common language, which was also the one that was used to make the skill card's content. Through the acts of worshipping beastly gods, they would transfer whatever skills they possess into the cards, with the mount enhancement technique being one of them. By now, Abel's pretty much had a full understanding of what the skill card was. It was something that was used by the Orc Empire. Unlike the orcs who used their blood to activate it, Abel used his power of the will. While there were upsides with using this method, it was also risky in its own ways. If the priest who made this card were in a higher rank, there was no telling of what would happen to Abel's mind. Having learned the language of the orcs, Abel picked up the parchment map and started reading it. It was a map marked with times and locations of where the invasion troop would be rallied. Abel was very excited to recognize it, because by doing so, he could very easily stop the invaders from entering into the realms of humanity. Honestly, though, such important intel should have never been brought by a regular orc. The humans got lucky this time. If Simon didn't leave his team to wait for the Mount Wolf to give its birth, he would have never had to draw a copy of the map while in hiding. It was getting late now. After realizing so, Abel finally remembered that his horses were still in the Wirgin's camp. He then walked back slowly to where he came from. While the two horses were still there was also a Mount Wolf that was sitting next to them. As the Wargen had killed off any wild beasts nearby, the horses remained calm as they chewed on the grass that was below them. The Mount Wolf stood up at the sight of Abel. Realizing how long its master had gone, it raised its head in a worrisome manner. What a shame. An adult Mount Wolf could only recognize one master for the entirety of its own life. With the Wargen being killed, there was no longer a cause for it to be alive. Abel slowly walked towards the Mount Wolf. He revealed his ice magic sword from his back and slowly approached the beast. The Mount Wolf wasn't looking to fight back, though. If anything, there was a very strong sadness that was displayed in its eyes. Master didn't come back, but it was an enemy that had come to end its life. The Mount Wolf began to wail, almost as if it was trying to beg for mercy. Abel felt kind of confused to see this. While the night was near, he could still see a small shadow struggling its way out of its dying mother. Whilst going against what Abel has learned before, the Mount Wolf was giving off birthright here, out in a battlefield that was extremely close to the enemy's territory. The Orc Empire was supposed to be very strict in controlling their livestock. They were not supposed to let any pregnant Mount Wolf be in any sort of danger, let alone letting it inside the human world. What Abel was witnessing now was an outlier, a phenomenon that was by all means not supposed to be. Had it novel been at? Since the Orc Empire was the one that controlled the Mount Wolf population, most humans would have never seen one in their whole life. That being said, humans knew very little about how they behaved. It wasn't like they were completely clueless, though. For starters, it was rumored that Mount Wolves recognized the first living thing they see as their masters. They were also known to be extremely loyal and would go to extreme lengths to protect the ones they thought to be important. Because of their intelligence and extraordinary speed, Mount Wolves were regarded as one of the most valuable animals to be owned in this world. For people in this world, a good animal to ride on was the same as a racing car. The fanaticism behind was pretty much the same, even more so when the opportunity to see one was so rare. As Abel stood where he was, the Mount Wolf began to focus back on giving off birth. Despite being in a lot of agony, It didn't make any sound as it was afraid of being a hindrance to its stillborn offspring. Eventually, the little thing came out and rested beside its mother. The Mount Wolf, as it had fulfilled in its role, was too tired to even keep its eyes opened. It laid right where it was at and tried to have some rest. However, such things were a luxury in the presence of a foe. The Mount Wolf raised its head to look at Abel. It then looked down its head and began licking the furs of its own child. Through this very fact, there was a very strong love and a sense of satisfaction that was being conveyed. Suddenly, the Mount Wolf stood up from the ground and ran towards an old tree, which was about 50 centimeters in its width. Abel thought that it was trying to attack him and quickly readied himself for defense. However, there was no longer a reason for conflict. The Mount Wolf had crashed its skull against the tree. Without bothering Abel, it had ended its own life in the quickest way possible. What boldness and loyalty! The Mount Wolf loved its child, but nothing stood in the way for it to devote everything to its master. Not even its own child, and not even its own life. Abel raised his ice magic sword and started digging on the ground. Within no time at all, he's dug up a hole that was big enough to bury the Mount Wolf in. It was just an animal, yes, but it was a dignified spirit that was deserving of respect. He didn't want the other beasts to ravage on its remains. After the burial was done, the baby pup began to cry, as if mourning for the being that gave it its own life. Upon hearing this, Abel picked it up from the ground and wrapped his arms around it. It was a very light puppy, covered in black furs that were drenched for being licked. It was soft, so soft that Abel had to try very hard not to hurt it. It was an innocent life, which, for reasons Abel wasn't sure of, made him felt like he was its own father. As though having found its mother, the Mount Wolf pup kept on rubbing its head against Abel while it was in his arms. For Abel, it felt kind of itchy for him, in a good way, sort of. He started patting the pup on its head, which had responded by rubbing its head against Abel even more. Abel carried the pup towards his horses. Now that he's found himself a new partner, he was even less keen on spending the night in the forest. There was nothing he could feed it here. For that reason, he had to go back to Hairy Castle now. Just when Abel was about to approach his horses, they started panicking at the scent of the baby Mount Wolf. Understandably enough, wolves were a natural predator for beasts such as them. While this particular wolf was just a puppy, their instincts were telling them very much otherwise. After patting the horses on their backs, Abel was able to calm them down enough to proceed his way back home. He held the reins in one of his hands and used another to hold onto the baby Mount Wolf. He wasn't riding the horses, though. It wasn't safe to ride horses in the middle of a forest. Besides, the sky was starting to turn dark, so the only way he could go home was on foot. At it novel Benedat. As he held onto the baby Mount Wolf, it started raising its head to lick his face. Its crystal eyes were looking straight at him, as though it had already decided to follow him for the rest of its life. And it did indeed. Mount Wolves were loyal beasts. While such a tendency was uncommon for other animals, they decide their masters from the moment they were born. With one of his hands holding onto the Mount Wolf, Abel placed another on top of its head. His rank wasn't high enough for him to transfuse his combat chi into it, but he did remember the spells for mount enhancement. By uttering the same enchantments as the orcs would praise their beastly gods, he could forge a spiritual pact with it. It's good that no one else was around. If they heard Abel speaking the language of the orcs, he would have been sent to a temple to be executed. Well, that's if they understood it in the first place. Actually, who cares? Abel was in a forest. No one is going to see him breaking any taboos. On a side note, most of the abilities that the orcs possessed had something to do with their faith. They had great admiration and respect for the gods that they worshipped, and would often include words of praise in the spells that they used. As Abel enchanted the magical words, a green light began to flash on the hand that was placed on top of the Mount Wolf's head. It started flashing bigger and eventually surrounded everything that was around them. While the light was too bright for Abel to see, he could hear a weak cry that was calling out to him. It was a cry of happiness, of a love that was so pure that even the strongest forces couldn't break it apart. Abel felt it. He felt it from the bottom of his heart and was moved to allow it into his soul. Eventually, the green light became so thin that it vanished in the air, but the bond that was built only grew stronger by the minutes. Just by being around a Mount Wolf, Abel could know what it was feeling. Come to think of it, Abel hadn't named the Mount Wolf yet. Since it was covered in black furs, the first thing he's thought of was Black Wind. When the pup reached its adulthood, he wanted it to run as fast as the wind. Your name is now Black Wind. Is that okay with you, Black Wind? Abel wanted to explain his thoughts behind this name, but the pup was too young to understand something so complex as symbolism. Anyways, Black Wind it shall be. You're not against it, are you? I don't sense that you have anything against it. All right, I'll call you Black Wind from now on, then. Having named the Mount Wolf, Abel walked back the battleground and saw the dead war djinn lying on the ground. If he was just going to leave it right there, no one was going to believe that he had killed war djinn by himself. Not wanting to let his achievements go to waste, Abel carried the dead war djinn and put it on top of his horse. He then continued his way back to Harry Castle. It was getting kind of dark in the forest. After stopping for a bit, Abel made a torch from a branch he picked up from the ground. Luckily for him, apart from a few snakes that he encountered, there weren't a lot of large beasts on his path back. Things were kind of going well for him. After walking for a few more hours, Abel came out of the forest and went back to Harry Castle. Oddly enough, the front gate was looking different from what it used to be. There were torches hung on the wall and a lot more guards who were patrolling around. Who's that? One of the guards called out as Abel approached the front gate. In just a few seconds, more guards came and had their arrows pointed towards him. It's Abel. Abel raised his torch so that it was closer to his face. Open the door so I can go in. The young master's back. Master Abel. As the guards began cheering for Abel, they lifted the castle gate and allowed him to enter. To Abel's surprise, he saw a lot of tents when he had just come in. Every time he was about to pass by one of them, people would come out and say hello to him. Good night to you, sir. Sir Abel. Master Abel. From what Abel could see, these were all farmers who lived in the Harry Knight's domain. They came inside Harry Castle because of the orcs' invasion. The Knight of Marshall must have sent them in during the daytime. Speaking of the Knight of Marshall, he didn't have any sleep at all. He was getting so worried that Abel hadn't come back, so he just stayed in his office whilst having his armor on. He did hear that Abel was out to test his new weapons, but because of how late it was, he's already sent a few men to search in the forest. For the Knight of Marshall, it was a difficult thing for him to not know where Abel was. Besides helping out his good friend, the Knight of Bennett, he took Abel in because he wanted an heir to take on his family name. In that sense, Abel didn't need to do anything to be helpful to him. However, what this child did over the past few months was simply far beyond all expectations. Because of Abel's achievements during the invasion outside Harvest City, the Knight of Marshall was rewarded with his weapons store. Because of Abel's ability to make magic weapons, Harry Castle was now one of the most fortified castles around Harvest City. Because of Abel's status as a master blacksmith, the Knight of Marshall was a celebrity figure whenever he went. Abel was a phenomenon kid, and he was bound to be so much more than that. Whilst thinking about everything that Abel had done for him, the Knight of Marshall became even more worried about his disappearance. If the butler Lindsay didn't come in on time, he would have gone to the forest himself to look for Abel. Master, Sir Abel is back, the butler Lindsay said with a rushed tone. It was rare for him to be this intrusive, but understandably so. He came back, the Knight of Marshall exclaimed, and ran to the Harry Castle's front gate. As happy as he was to see that Abel was alive, he found it strange that there was a corpse on one of the horses. The Knight of Marshall widened his eyes. Why did you bring a dead war djinn back? Just after he said that, the Knight of Marshall began to notice something even stranger. Abel was holding a Mount Wolf pup in his arms. It wasn't supposed to be here, but somehow it was right here and it was looking straight at him. The Knight of Marshall said with a shaky voice, I say that a Mount Wolf you're holding? Abel? Wait a second. Oh my, it is a Mount Wolf. Where did you found it? Abel? Hasn't found a master yet. As a knight who survived the war against the orcs, the Knight of Marshall was very much in awareness of how precious a Mount Wolf was. That being said, it was a miracle for Abel to bring back one that was just yet born, and an even greater myth for it to be collected with a dead war djinn. The war djinn must have been at least rank 6 for it to appear next to a pup. But who could have had killed it? There was no way that Abel could have killed anything that was at rank 6, but who or what else could have done it? Whilst facing the mountain of questions that were thrown at him, Abel was at a loss for words. He didn't expect such a strong reaction from the Knight of Martial, so it was hard for him to start explaining the things that he saw. For now, though, Blackwind was hungry, so the first thing he did was to ask for some sheep milk from the butler Lindsay. Once returned to the Hairy Castle's main hall, Abel told everything that he saw to the Knight of Martial. At the same time, he's also brought the map that was drawn on the parchment paper. Thankfully enough, the Knight of Martial was able to read some of the characters that were used by the orcs. He had recognized some of the locations marked on the map and was able to point out some of the more crucial routes for those invaders. The Knight of Martial walked around the room whilst having an extremely intense expression on his face. This map is way too important for us, Abel. With this in our hands, we can effectively stop these orcs from ever entering into the realm of mankind. I don't think the orcs are going to be too easy to fight off this time, Abel said with concern. I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but the wolf riders I've faced are all at least above rank 6. We won't have enough archers for them if they keep coming at this pace. The Knight of Martial wasn't too worried. If anything, he was very optimistic about this whole situation. Why, of course, we're not going to take on them all. Here's the deal. I give this map to the Lord of Harvest City, and we do fend off the invasion this time and have enough dead orcs on our hands. Abel, you are going to be anointed as a lord. The Knight of Martial then said with a more serious tone, For now, Abel, you are not allowed to be out without a company. Whenever you leave the castle, you must let someone know first and bring some guards with you. As for that Mount Wolf you've picked up, well, don't tell the others about it. I'll tell the others to keep their mouths shut as well. Once they've reached a certain rank, Mount Wolves tend to stay loyal to their owners, the Knight of Martial's side. Same with that one. That being said, there's always going to be someone who would try to take it back. Whatever you say, Uncle, Abel said without complaint. For all intents and purposes, the Knight of Martial knew a lot more than he did about how the nobles were like. Besides, Blackwind was still a puppy. Once it had reached full size, Abel would have grown so strong already that no one could take anything away from him. To be honest, however, this kind of thought process just showed how little the Knight of Martial and Abel knew about the Blacksmith Guild. If Master Bentham was here, he would have warned these scoundrels about the severe consequences of crossing a human with the title of a Master Blacksmith. Do you still have those large beast traps with you? The Knight of Martial asked. While he was well aware of how terrifying the wolf riders were, he was very interested in finding ways to slow them down. I don't have them with me now, Abel replied without expecting to be asked about his traps. I've set up all 10 of them in the forest behind the castle. I didn't mark them, though. If you want to, I can retrieve them by tomorrow. Can you have the other blacksmiths make it for you? The Knight of Martial asked urgently. Abel shook his head. Probably not, I think. There's a special technique that I've used to make one of the parts. Having become a master blacksmith himself, Abel knew how far technology had progressed in this world. That being said, not many people could make a metal spring the same way as he did. To produce the special metal that was needed to make a spring, one would have to use a large amount of carbon to reduce the steel's durability, meanwhile ensuring that its elasticity was maintained. Forget the humans. Only masters dwarves could handle work as delicate as this. Can you make a lot of these traps for me, Abel? I know they're meant for hunting, but they could also be great defense tools if we lay them around the castle. Yes, Abel affirmed. All I need to do is to make the more complex parts. You can have the other blacksmiths make the simpler parts. Sure. Make as many of those crucial parts. Do it whenever you have free time. I want those traps in place as early as possible, the Knight of Martial said impatiently. Go tell the patrol squad where you've set up the trap, and they will get them for you. And don't go out for the next few days. I've already moved the blacksmith shop into the castle. Things are going very dangerous outside the castle. At night, after returning to his bedroom, Abel got some warm sheep milk from Lindsay and fed it to Blackwind. In order to not spill it, he's also asked for a sheet of gerbil skin. A gerbil was kind of like a rat. Because of how thin and soft its skin was, it was often used to make all sorts of small textile objects. With that in mind, Abel asked the maid to make a pacifier for him. While the resulting product was not very aesthetically appealing, he did get himself a very useful feeding bottle in the end. With the pacifier next to its mouth, Black Wind started suckling for some sheep milk. Its premature teeth bit hard onto the bottle, and its tiny face looked very satisfied when it was doing so. Abel never had a pet when he was living on Earth. He didn't know the feeling of having a pet, and he's never understood the people who would treat pets like they were their own children. For a while, though, he's really thought of Black Wind as his own baby. Meanwhile, the Knight of Marshall had sent the parchment map to Lord Dickens. To fully earn Lord Dickens's trust, he even had his men sending a whole dead body of a war gen. To be honest, if it wasn't because of how urgent things were, he would have paid the visit himself in person. The next morning, after waking up from his bed, Abel came to the de facto blacksmith shop that was set up in the castle storage. With the help of Master Bentham and the other men, he gathered up all the blacksmiths and began instructing them on the parts that were to be made. By now, Abel had become quite familiar with creating his beast trap. For the large, thick springs that were essential to this piece, he would spend a whole day making 15 replicas of them. He did this for 3 days. The other blacksmiths were quite fast, too. Under Abel's instructions, they, too, managed to make all the other parts after 3 days. Having assembled all the parts together, Master Bentham started filing the edges of all the teeth on the traps. This was so that the blades would dig deeper when the prey had fallen for it. Thanks to how experienced the patrol squad was, the other 10 traps were also retrieved back from the forest. There were now 25 beast traps ready for defending Harry Castle. To test the effectiveness of his new trap, Abel threw a branch on top of the pressure pad, which, in a blink of an eye, was penetrated by its razor-sharp teeth. If the branch was the leg of a mount, then the war gen riding on top of it would have immediately lost the ability to move. All in all, it was a result that the Knight of Marshall was very satisfied with, and that should have just about ended the invasion right there. To begin with, orcs would have never attacked a castle with just a few squads on their side. The walls were too high for their steads to have any use, and a forced push would only result in unnecessary casualties. They were not technologically advanced enough to develop any sort of siege engine. With all that out of the way, the only asset that they had were their wolves, but even a rank 7 wolf rider couldn't jump over a castle gate. As powerless as the orcs were against a fort, the Knight of Marshall had everyone concentered to the center of the Harry Castle. He reinforced some of the castle's weak spot with the large beast traps, especially in the forest somewhere 30 meters behind the fort. If the orcs were looking for an invasion, he would need to stop them from having any access to a large amount of timber. If the traps were activated, the scouts would know the direction of the attack right away. After finishing the traps requested from him, Abel was finally spared with some free time of his own. Instead of taking a break, though, he decided to reminisce about his last encounter with the war gen. Looking back, that fight with the war gen had really made he understood his difference to someone with an official occupation. Yes, a rank 5 novice knight was only a rank away from an official occupation holder, but a rank 5 novice knight could not multiply his powers with combat chi. Despite its injury, that war gen had completely outpaced Abel in every conceivable way. Honestly, he was being completely dominated at the time. If it wasn't for his luck, he wasn't even sure if he would stand where he was right now. Once having reached the rank of a beginner occupation holder, one could utilize his combat chi to increase his physical strength. On the other hand, an intermediate occupation holder could channel his combat chi to his weapon. It was the same technique as the one that the Knight of Marshall had used outside of Harvest City. By loading his energy onto his heavy sword, both the power and the sharpness of his weapon were increased by double. That just showed how insane this technically was. Things didn't stop there, though. After becoming an advanced occupation holder, one could essentially launch mid-range attacks with his combat chi. On the battlefield, he could even overpower an army of about 100 men. With the free time that he had, Abel decided to use it for some power-up first. By power-up, he would like to start with his weapons. Thinking back to his encounter with the war gen, he did remember himself wanting some sort of long-range weapon in his hands. Even if he couldn't make the right aim, he could have at least slowed it down. Abel had spent a great deal of his time thinking about making projectile weapons. He did do his research on the kind of bows that were produced in this world, but his main interest had lied in something a little different. He wanted to craft a 70-pound compound bow, the same one he had used during his time on Earth. The greatest thing about compound bows was how energy efficient they were. To put it mathematically, if you were to save up 80% of your total strength, you would only need about 14 pounds of force to hold the string while it was being pulled. Conveniently enough, all that remaining strength would be used for improving accuracy and adjusting the wielder's postures. If you were to save up 60% of your total strength, you would need about 28 pounds of force to keep the bow in its fully pulled state. When you do, the shot would be a lot faster and much stronger. With the blessing of the power of the will on his side, Abel could recall memories with an extraordinary level of detail. That being, he had a very clear memory of what a compound bow should be like. He knew what parts were essential to make one, and he knew all the sizes of these parts. Let's see. Idler wheel, cam, upper and lower limb, grip, arrow rest, string slider, string stabilizer, handle, bus cable, limb pocket, string silencer, and cam. Apart from the main pars, there are also parts such as an attachable arrow rest, sight, release aid, a stick for reducing vibration, a peeping hole, and a wrist rope. That's pretty much all the parts of a complete set of a modern compound bow. While this world was not blessed with technology, the people living in it were much stronger than the people on Earth. It wasn't hard to figure that out. As far as Abel knew, he's never heard of someone slicing a human and a horse in half with just one swing of a word. And remember, the Knight of Martial was an intermediate knight. As insane as his achievement, there was no telling what people stronger than he could do. If anything, Abel was already stronger than most people on Earth. At a ridiculously young age of 13, he was able to release a total of 400 pounds of force with just his raw strength. During his time on Earth as a bodybuilding trainer, the tightest bow he could pull was only about 70 pounds in total. While it was impossible to find the same raw ingredients here as one would on Earth, Abel was free to craft the bow in however ways he desired. That being said, he could use some very sturdy materials with little to no regard for the resulting weight of the bow. He was a strong kid, and everyone was pretty strong in this world. At it novel been at. Having made a list of the things he needed to make, Abel started drawing sketches on multiple pieces of paper. When he was done, he would label the size of these parts and think about the sort of materials he would need for them. For the idler wheel and the power wheel, Abel thought that he would use one bearing to support both of their rotating motion. There were a couple of reasons to do this. Reducing friction, improving the accuracy of the spin. While it was a crucial part of the bow, he would have to make the two wheels by treating them for 100 times. Because of how much time the upper and the lower limbs would take, Abel decided that he wasn't going to make them himself. So how was he going to get them? Simple. He would go to the storage room and take them out of two heavy bows. There were a few 200-pound bows in the storage room. While they were the finest bows in Harry Castle, almost nobody in the castle could use them properly. For starters, one would at least have to be above being a rank 4 novice to pull the bowstring. And even if one could manage to do that, he would have to use the same amount of force to aim at his target. In this sense, you would technically need about 300 pounds of force if you want to use the bow properly. If Abel could get his hands on these heavy bows, he would have himself a bow limb and 2 extra strings. He was going to make a massive limb for his new bow, which would use up to 2 whole limbs of a heavy bow for its upper and lower limb. For the stabilizers, Abel would use the same timber as the ones he could take apart from these heavy bows. For the handle and the arrow rest, he would make from bases of 100 skills. Abel commenced his work after he did all of his blueprints. Having taken 2 heavy bows out of the storage room, he found himself a bow maker to help him make the compound bow. While he was not very confident in his bow limb, he decided to have a professional checking it for him. The bow maker, being a professional in his area, had a sad, "What a waste this is" look on his face when he took apart the 2 heavy bows. He cut the wood into the sizes that Abel had drawn on paper and glued the limbs together with some fish gel. Abel was very pleased with the resulting product. For the stabilizers, Abel found himself a carpenter who followed his instructions and made the parts as requested. After every other part was done, it was now Abel's turn to make his bearing. While it was not known to many people, The bearing was the most important part of every machinery on Earth. A bearing would consist of 3 parts: the inner race, the outer race, and about several balls that would roll around the space between the inner and the outer race. As difficult as it was to make bearings, they were mostly made in factories by mechanical beds. Abel didn't have access to a mechanical bed, of course. He would have to rely on himself only, which, even for a master blacksmith like him, was not an easy job to do. Abel started with the balls. He made himself a vernier scale, and after hitting small pieces of iron into little spheres, he would use it to make sure that he's got the exact measurement that he wanted. It was a very, very exhausting process. For a single small ball, it would take him about several hours to make. After making his first ball, Abel used some clays and water to build himself a molding model. It was kind of like the wet sand casting process, which was used to replicate pieces of metal from liquid form. By making one ball with his hands, Abel was able to make 30 copies of it with just his clay mold. While only 12 balls were needed for one bearing, Abel decided to make some spares in case he needed them. With that in mind, he got himself some iron so he could melt them for casting. He had expected this to be the most annoying process, mainly because he would have to use charcoals to slowly liquefy the metal pieces. Luckily, Master Bentham gave him this ointment for raising a fire's heat. With just a few drops into the flame, the metal pieces started melting in a very short time. Abel poured the liquid iron into 30 of his clay mold. Once they had all cooled down, Abel took them and filed the edges for a bit. Once he was done, he's got himself 30 perfect small iron balls. Next up, Abel had to combine the inner and outer race with the iron balls. Whilst looking back to the many physics lectures and documentaries he had watched in the past, he got out some pieces of ice and stuffed them into the inner race. He took the outer race and put it inside the stove. That's right, he was using the thermal expansion and thermal contraction to combine the 3 parts in order. After he was done making his bearing, Abel made his idler wheel and power wheel and attached them all. Soon, he's got himself the first compound bow of the history of this world. Realizing how late it was, Abel hid away the compound bow and went back home. The next morning, after playing with Black Wind for a while, Abel went for some testing and shooting. He got himself 50 arrows with the intention of shooting them all in one practice. Abel took out his first arrow, placed it on the arrow rest, and pulled on his release aid. Unlike what he had imagined, the tightness of the string was unlike anything he saw before. With the combined power of 2 heavy bows, the compound bow would take more than 400 pounds of force to be pulled. As hard as it was for Abel to pull on the string, it was a lot easier for him to hold it after he did. That's the beautiful thing about a compound bow. Once having pulled it apart, you wouldn't even 100 pounds of force to keep the arrow in release mode. Abel aimed towards his target, which was about 50 meters away from where he was standing. With a light press of the trigger on his release aid, the arrow was fired away at a pace that was not visible. It shot right through the center of the target and continued to fly for 30 meters more into the back wall before it finally stopped. Damn, this shooting range was already the longest one in the entire Harry Castle. Abel did confirm that there was no problem in the bow's release and aim, but he didn't have a chance to test its maximum range of fire. Still, just look at that clean hole in front of him. For all his experience with archery, Abel has never heard of an arrow that could still fly straight after 50 meters. Anyways, one thing was for sure though. No matter how bizarre his compound bow was, it was the most technologically advanced in this world. Upon hearing the urgent noises of the bell, Abel readied himself whilst picking up his compound bow and quiver. Then, he ran his way to the castle's front gate. When he was just about to pass through the town square, everyone seemed panicked to see him. None one knew what was going on. Having climbed a ladder on the side of the retaining wall, the first thing that Abel saw was the sight of the Knight of Martial in his full set of armor. He was standing right on the edge of the castle with about 20 of his own guards standing beside him. All of them were holding a long spear in their hands. The Knight of Martial got worried when he noticed that Abel was here. "Were you up here, Abel? Go back inside the castle. It's dangerous around here." Without listening to the words of his adoptive father, Abel probed his head out of the retaining wall. He wasn't able to get a good view, though. An arrow was just shot at him the moment he drew his head out. Luckily for him, He was quick enough to dodge with his head and managed to shot the thing down with his own bow. As fast as that was, Abel did see about 20 orcs outside the wall. Some of them were riding on top of wolves while others were using Inferno Bovine as their stead. "Why are the orcs here?" Abel asked in surprise. "There are 2 or 3 squads of them here. That's how many of them they need to take down a fort," the Knight of Martial replied, then said with a sneer, "Not this one, though. Not with that. Where are our own archers?" Abel asked in frustration. He was just being fired at a few seconds ago. "Are we just going to let them stay there?" "There are only 5 archers in the castle." The Knight of Martial pointed toward the bunch of injured soldiers over the distance. 2 of them were already injured. The rest, they're no match for their wolf-riding opponents. I have ordered them not to fight back. As undesirable as that sounded, the Knight of Martial continued to mock the invaders. "These imbeciles have picked the wrong place to attack. They're no match for the walls that hold us here." "Wait, is that a bow in your hand?" Realizing that there was a bow in Abel's hand, the Knight of Martial began to have a puzzled look on his face. "Yeah," Abel said smugly, "this thing has pretty nice firepower to it." To be honest, Abel wanted to talk so much more about his compound bow. He wanted to show off about how he had invented a quick, easy-to-use, and long-range weapon in this backward timeline. However, since he couldn't explain it within anyone, he decided to stop after one sentence. With a quick skim of his eyes, the Knight of Martial quickly understood the mechanism behind this compound bow. He took an arrow out of Abel's quiver, placed it on the nock of his bow, and started laughing when he saw the shape of the release aid that Abel had just made. "It's a good design that you've made," the Knight of Martial commented. "Instead of using just your fingers, you use this so you can use your entire arm strength." He then said after seeing the small lever on the release aid, "No wonder they call you a master blacksmith. With this little thing here, you can shoot an arrow very easily without hurting your fingers." Archers were one of the most difficult soldiers to train because they had to rest after they practiced for about 30 to 40 shots. Besides, the fingers are the most delicate parts of a human's body. If a bowman injured his fingers, he could no longer use a bow and arrows for the remainder of his life. Even without these said reasons, it was already pretty hard to find someone with the right talent. This was why, despite the fact that there were so many guards within Harry Castle, only a handful got to learn how to shoot arrows. The Knight of Martial began to use the release aid on the bow. Once he pulled on the string, a white aura flashed out of his body before the arrow was released. To his surprise, he couldn't pull the bow string completely, but was only able to hold it for a while after stretching a little. This was a very tight bow. After using about 80% of his strength, the Knight of Martial had almost immediately failed to hold the bow in its place. If he didn't release his combat chi on time, he would have lost so much face in front of Abel. The Knight of Bennett would have laughed so hard if he learned how hard it was for an intermediate knight to even pull a bow. Strangely enough, once you've pulled the string and hold it there for a while, it was not very hard to keep it in place. The Knight of Martial widened his eyes when he took notice of this. "What is up with this bow, Abel?" he asked without even having an idea of what the question should be. As far as he could tell, this piece that Abel made was nothing like any bow he had seen before. Actually, screw it. With so many living targets outside the fort, he might as well just test the bow's effectiveness right away. The Knight of Martial quickly stood up. Having locked his arrow to a wolf rider, he quickly released it from his hands. It didn't hit, however. Instead, it very quickly flew over the wolf rider's head. The orc saw the shot, too. Just when they were about to dodge it, the arrow had already went past them and flew further beyond. "Hark, hark!" The orcs laughed as they pointed their fingers at the Knight of Martial. Then, one of the Taurens threw an axe at him. Unbothered by ridiculing noises of his enemy, the Knight of Martial caught it with his bare hand. The martial knight asked as he threw the axe to the ground, "What can I shoot with this bow, Abel?" Abel pointed towards the marking on the bow. "That's because I've just made it, uncle. The only testing that I've done with it was at a 50-meter shooting range. If you were firing from here, you'd have to shoot the arrow in a straight line." That was all that the Knight of Martial had to hear. During his past experience with archery, he'd always have to point directly above the target that he aimed to shoot. In other words, he had to shoot in curved lines. Now, he had to use a different technique because of the firepower he was given. The Knight of Martial pulled the bow again. This time, it was aimed at the Tauren that was laughing the most. On click of the bow, and its skull was crushed the moment the Knight of Martial had released his finger. It didn't stop there, though. After punching a hole with the size of a fist, the arrow went through the Tauren's head and was plunged into the heart of a wolf rider. The orcs got pretty panicked after that. They would never expect an archer to hit a double kill. No, not right after a complete miss. Arrow. Martial Knight reached his hand out to Abel, to which Abel responded as he quickly took an arrow out of the quiver. Having reloaded himself up, the Knight of Martial began to look for a new target. The distance between the orcs and the wall was about 50 to 60 meters. With that in mind, a shot was guaranteed as long as the bow was directly aligned to its target. The Knight of Martial pressed the trigger again. This time, it was an orc that had fallen to the ground. Without doing much talking, Abel passed another arrow into the Knight of Martial's hand. 3 shots were fired after that, and 6 of the orcs were down on the ground. The surviving ones saw this and retreated as fast as they could. The Knight of Martial wasn't sparing them, though. Unlike the orcs, the Taurens remained on the battlefront. It wasn't because they were braver. If anything, it was because their steads were much slower than that of the wolf riders. Had it novel been at, having readied his arrow, the Knight of Martial aimed the bow towards the Tauren who was the last one in line. As relatively slow as its stead was, it still ran a 10-meter distance within a short amount of time. With that in mind, there were about 70 meters between it and the Knight of Martial. Without thinking too long on it, the Knight of Martial aimed his bow horizontally to his target. If he held the bow slightly lower than it should be, he could still hit the stead even if he missed. Without something to ride, there was no way a Tauren could have ran out of his range. It was headshot from 70 meters away. It was clean shot towards the Tauren, and the poor thing fell to the ground on the spot. Another one from 80 meters away. It was another Tauren. It got down too after the trigger was pulled. 90 meters away. Another one down. 100 meters? No problem. Another down. The last Tauren was about 110 meters away from the Knight of Martial. Once again, he released the arrow and succeeded to hit his target. It was in the neck, though, which was a tad off from being the perfect shot. It was now the time to use the sight on the bow. All the Taurens were pretty much gotten rid of. Even the slowest wolf rider was about 150 meters away from the Knight of Martial. Unfortunately for that one, though, the Knight of Martial could still hit a headshot whilst using the sight on the bow. In fact, the hit was so impactful that the wolf rider was thrown off after that hit. Realizing how frightening the archer that was the Knight of Martial was, the wolf riders quickly covered their heads with their bare hands. The wolves they were riding on the hand, covered their master with their whole body. As the threat of death was imminent upon them, the beasts decided to shield their masters as a means of displaying their loyalty. The Knight of Martial decided to stop after that. For a knight such as him, eliminating the enemy's stead was not something that should be done when the victory was already taken. For now, he was more than satisfied with the result of this battle. Looking at the bow and arrow in his hands, the Knight of Martial would never imagined in a million years that the castle's crisis could be solved by only shooting some arrows. He wondered, could this be the true power of a blacksmith master? As Abel looked at the martial knight, deeply drawn by the composite bow, his facial expression became very familiar to Abel's. It was the same expression when the knight was looking at his beloved armor. Abel hoped that the Knight of Martial would return the composite bow to him. After a while, Abel reached out his hand. He wanted to take the bow back from the martial knight. However, the composite bow remained glued to the Knight of Martial's hand. Even when Abel had pulled on it a few times, it did not budge a single bit. Abel, your uncle's been good to you this whole time, hasn't he? The smile on the Knight of Martial's face reminded Abel of the wolf's expression in Little Red Riding Hood. It sent shivers to Abel down to his spine. Abel lowered his head and said, Uncle Martial is very good to me. Your Uncle Martial has never had a good bow. You know, as an intermediate knight, I was always embarrassed to take my ugly bows out on the streets. Until now, the Knight of Martial said pitifully. Abel rolled his eyes. Every time the Knight of Martial went outside, he would wear the most expensive clothes, carry a magical sword, and put on the shiniest armor. Even horses were stronger than the average war horses. Therefore, why would he carry ordinary bows and arrows around? In the able understanding of the Knight of Martial, equipment were the most important things to him. Unless it was necessary for combat, he would not carry any ordinary equipment with him. The Knight of Martial knew that this bow might be very difficult to make. However, how could he return something he had already revived? That was not his style. Today's military service had been overachieved. 12 orcs were killed outside the castle, but these were not just ordinary orcs. If they were just ordinary orcs, the Knight of Martial would not have hidden inside his own castle and not dare to fight. These orcs were at least level 6, and every single one of them knew how to fight with combat chi. The Knight of Martial was only an intermediate knight. He could defeat these orcs if they were having a 1-to-1 battle. However, the orcs were often more powerful than the human of the same level. This was because of their stronger build and years of battle experience. It made them machines for war. The Knight of Martial did not remember when was the last time he had felt this thrilled. He stood on the defense wall, shooting an arrow for each orc. This bow was like a messenger of death, killing anything that got in the way. At it novel been at. Seeing the 40-year-old martial knight trying to act cute in front of him, Abel felt defeated. He hopelessly glanced in sorrow at the composite bow in the hands of the Knight of Martial. He felt this 400-pound super composite bow drifting further and further away from him. At last, Abel waved his hand and said, "Uncle Martial, since you like it so much, you can take it." Martial Knight let out a huge laugh. He pulled on the bow and made an archery stand. He then proudly looked at Abel and said, "Only the most powerful knight can use a godly bow like this. Uncle Martial, if you pull on the bow too hard without an arrow, it can badly damage the bow, and I don't have any spare parts to repair it for you." Abel ignored the martial knights pretending to be cool and ruthlessly pointed out the main weakness of the bow. The Knight of Martial stopped laughing. He carefully retracted his force and slowly began to restore the bowstring into its original position. However, there were also some obvious differences between this bow and any ordinary bows. When a person pulls on the bow, it requires their full force. However, once the bowstring retracts, the more force it requires. A white light of combat chi appeared from the Knight of Martial's body as he was restoring the bow. Finally, the bowstring flattened. The Knight of Martial wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and anxiously observed the bow. He had only just received this godly bow, so pretending to be cool was definitely not worth the risk of damaging it. Abel sighed. He depressingly left the guarding wall. He would now need to go back to the Blacksmith Guild to make a second composite bow. He needed to make 2 new ones in total, one for himself and one for his father, the Knight of Bennett. Abel understood very well that, since he gave the composite bow to the Knight of Martial, it would not take long until he showed it off in front of the Knight of Bennett. Therefore, if he didn't also make one for the Knight of Bennett, he would have felt very sorry. Although his father, the Knight of Bennett, would not say anything to him, Abel knew deep down his father would feel very sad. Open the gate of the castle, drag the dead bodies back, and also don't forget the mounts. The Knight of Martial shouted at the cavalries waiting inside the castle gates. After the gate of the castle was opened, 10 of the cavalry rushed out. There were 2 grieving mount wolves remaining in the battlefield. When they saw the human appearing, they immediately rushed forward and prepared for their last fight. However, the 2 mount wolves only got the chance to take a few steps before arrows pierced their skull from the guarding wall. The cavalries looked at their leader, the Knight of Martial in shiny armor, with adoration. Their leader signified the safety of the estate and their families. Other than the 2 mount wolves that were shot, there were also 4 inferno bovine outside the castle. All the other surviving mounts had ran along with the orcs. However, the inferno bovines were often not very smart and not that loyal either. Therefore, since inferno bovines were often worth quite a lot of money, they could be sold in the market after domestication. After the cavalries dragged the dead bodies and the 4 inferno bovine back to the castle, the Knight of Martial had already decided the fate of these bovines. He would convert his horse carriages into bovine carriages. He would keep 2 for himself and the other 2 for Abel. This way, the Knight of Martial could feel less guilty for taking his adopted son's weapon. However, the Knight of Martial actually didn't felt that guilty for taking Abel's bow. He knew if Abel could make a bow of this kind, he could make a second one. Also, the Knight of Martial thought that if didn't take the bow from Abel, maybe Abel would not have the motivation to make another bow again. The crisis had been resolved. There shouldn't be any more orcs who would dare to seek death at Harry Castle. Therefore, the Knight of Martial ordered the guards to patrol while he could have some rest. These days, the Knight of Martial had been very stressed, and he had never taken off his armor. He had to be the leader of the castle. If the orcs had appeared near a castle, the nobles of that castle could no longer leave their castles. This was a rule of war established for all mankind. If a common enemy of human had appeared in a noble's estate, and the noble left his estate, it would signify that he had given up his estate. This rule did not include the conflicts between humans. If 2 humans were battling against each other, and if one party knew that they couldn't win, surrender was always approved. Furthermore, because of the noble prisoner of war rule, no one would really want to take such a risk and pick a fight with a noble, unless they really possessed a deep hatred towards them. After returning to the Blacksmith Guild, Abel began his repetitive work again. He was making another 2 composite bows. He gathered the last 4 heavy bows in the warehouse, but since the Knight of Martial knew what Abel was doing, he did not become dissatisfied. This time, Abel had made a lot more than last time. He made 4 bearings, and even made a few extra of the large springs in preparation for upgrading his carriage. Abel was traumatized every time he rode on a carriage. He was too accustomed to the smoothness cars in his previous life, while the carriage of this world felt like it was dancing on rocks every time it moved. In the next 2 days, Abel spent all his energy on making the composite bows. Since he had gained the experience from his last attempt, the 2 composite bows he made this time had been further refined. Because the orcs were now all driven away, Abel decided to go outside to test out the range of his new bows. Abel perfected the scale of the sighting device. It was divided into 100 meters, 100 to 200 meters, 200 meters to 400 meters. Abel realized when shooting beyond 400 meters, the power of the arrow would be greatly reduced. So Abel estimated that the maximum range of these composite bow was within 400 meters. Any range beyond that would be impossible to kill anything. At most, it could only badly injure the enemy. Furthermore, the speed of the arrow would also be greatly reduced after 400 meters. Therefore, the enemy could easily avoid it. Upon completing the 2 composite bows, Abel was eager to send the bow to his father. Therefore, he had proposed to the Knight of Martial to visit Bennet Castle. Are you heading towards Bennet's castle now? I really don't suggest going because it's extremely dangerous out there right now. The Knight of Martial was hesitant to let Abel venture off during the current situation since he would be vulnerable to the attacking orcs outside. Even if Abel had brought a few guards with him, it still probably wasn't going to end well if they were forced into a fight. The orcs that had appeared were all above level 6. The guards were no match against these orcs, and if they were to fight, they probably couldn't even fend off a single orc. Uncle Marshall, I have to get to the Bennet Castle. You saw the power of my bow. I need to deliver the newly forged bows to the Bennet Castle. Otherwise, my family wouldn't stand a chance against those orcs, Abel explained, trying to persuade Knight of Martial to let him venture off to the Bennet Castle. Why are you willing to risk your life to give them the bow, when they didn't even ask for it? You know, I had to ask you before you would even give it to me, the Knight of Martial said with a hint of bitterness and jealousy on his face. After hearing what the Knight Martial said, Abel immediately spoke in an extremely serious manner. Well, this attack made me doubt the safety of the Bennet Castle. Just look at the power of these orcs. I must go and deliver the bow to them before it's too late. All right, if you insist to head towards the Bennet Castle, I'll go with you. The Knight of Martial felt that he had no choice. He grudgingly decided that he would head out to the Bennet Castle with Abel. For him, however, he was more concerned about Abel's safety than the safety of the castle. Since the castle had already killed off at least half of the attacking orcs, he was certain that the orcs wouldn't dare to come back and attack the castle unless if they wanted to commit suicide. Uncle Marshall, Are you sure you can come with me? Abel knew that it would have been extremely difficult for his uncle to leave the castle with the current situation, even though Bennett's castle wasn't too far away from them. If the Knight of Marshall was found wandering out with Abel, he would have lost all his estate because he went AWOL, absent without official leave. Besides that matter, the castle also needed the leadership and command from Knight of Marshall to effectively defend against any attacking orcs. Don't worry about it, Abel. It's fine. I will go to Bennett's castle with you. Just let me change into some different clothes so that people can't recognize me that easily. If we take the horses and ride as fast as we can, we should be able to return within half a day. The Knight of Marshall knew exactly what Abel was worried about, but to him, if he had lost his estate to someone else, he could always get it back in the future. If he lost Abel, however, he would have never been able to get someone's life back. The Knight of Marshall knew that, as long as he stayed with Abel and educated him well, their potential together would be limitless. They might even gain a bigger territory and a higher title than what they have now. It was already afternoon by the time they finished arguing. Shortly after, Abel equipped a leather armor suit and got onto a warhorse. For Knight Marshall, he wrapped his silky gold hair and swapped his eye-catching helmet into a less flashy one. Moreover, he also wore a hat that was capable of covering his face and took an ordinary warhorse so that no one would have noticed him during their trip to the Bennett Castle. Before the two began their journey, both warhorses were fed with oats, which helped maintain them within their peak performance as well as maximize their powers. Without notifying anyone, Abel and Knight Marshall quietly sneaked out of the castle when everyone inside the castle was celebrating in their successful attempt in defending against the orcs. Without taking any detours, the two horses galloped towards Bennett Castle in a straight line. By this time, there were no visible signs of life anywhere in the Lord's land between the Bennett Castle and Harry's Castle. This was because, during a battle, all civilians that were resided in these lands would have evacuated and gathered inside the castle for safety measures. This would have explained why Abel and Knight Marshall had not stumbled across anyone during their trip to the Bennett Castle. After 2 hours of traveling, Bennett's castle was finally visible within their eyesight. Abel could not help but feel a sense of relief as he took in a deep breath. In the distance, Bennett's castle stood firmly and quietly in the setting sun. The castle's entrance was shut tightly, and the guards of the castle were vaguely visible on the outskirt of the castle walls. Everything looked to be perfectly fine, and the Bennett Castle seemed to be unharmed. It didn't seem to be attacked by orcs. As Abel and Marshall approached closer and closer towards the castle, their arrival caused the emergency bell of the castle to ring rapidly. As they got closer to the entrance of the castle, they were met immediately with soldiers equipped with bows aiming down at them from the castle walls. "It's me, Abel. Open the door." Abel shouted. "Holster your weapon, guards. It's Master Abel." Someone yelled loudly. "Open the door." Suddenly, there were deep voices of Knight of Bennett coming from somewhere. Shortly after, the door of the Bennett Castle was slowly opened. When Abel and the Knight of Marshall entered the castle, the door was quickly closed for security to prevent any potential of attacks. "Abel, how dare you come to the castle during these dangerous times?" the Knight of Bennett said reproachfully towards Abel in a rather serious tone. "Father, I need to talk to you privately. Can we find a quiet place to talk? It's an urgent matter," Abel said quietly as he glanced over towards the Knight of Marshall, who took cover closely with Abel as he tried to prevent anyone from spotting him. For Abel to travel across to the Bennett Castle during these dangerous times, the Knight of Bennett certainly knew that there must have been something important. Else, Abel wouldn't have taken such a big risk to get here. The Knight of Bennett pitched a suspicious look at the mysterious knight, Knight Marshall, that was next to Abel. But without hesitation, he led the Abel and the mysterious knight into the guest room. He then told the guards to not disturb them as he closed the door once Abel and Marshall went inside. "Father, this is..." Abel was about to reveal the identity of the mysterious knight. The Knight of Bennett recognized the Knight of Marshall at first glance. He then immediately spoke up and said, "Marshall, have you gone out of your mind? You're leaving your territory during these dangerous times? You better have a valid reason for coming along with Abel." "Hey, Do you think I want to come here? Your silly boy said he had to come here. I couldn't just let him come here by himself. I had to follow him. Otherwise, he would have for sure ended up dead. Knight Marshall took off his hat, wobbled off his suppressed golden hair that was wrapped throughout the entire trip as he replied back to the Knight of Bennett in a rather angry attitude. God damn it. Marshall, you always cried when things went wrong. The Knight of Bennett helplessly shook his head while looking at Marshall. He then turned around and asked Abel, "What's the matter? Why do you have to act so mysteriously all the time? Did you think about the consequences if Marshall was caught leaving his territory? If he was caught, it would have been extremely inconvenient and troublesome for all parties involved. Father, I knew the consequences, but I've come all the way here from Harry's castle was to give you this." Abel took out a composite bow and passed it over to his father. Knight Bennett took the composite bow with his hands and started to fiddle with the bow. Promptly after, he asked Abel with a surprised tone, "You came all the way here just to give me this? What do you mean this, Bennett?" "This is the Harry's bow, a name that I've made for this special bow," Knight Marshall said with a sense of dissatisfaction since he was very upset with Bennett's attitude and his lack of appreciation for the special bow. Abel could not help but remain silent and covered his head. He knew that Marshall declared the name of the bow without consulting or even bothering to tell him. What's worse was that he even took his own name to classify the bow. Even though Abel had the same surname as the Knight of Marshall, he was certain that his uncle's intention of naming the bow Harry's bow was because he wanted it after his own name. "Bennett, it's not just an ordinary bow like you think it is. Here, try shooting an arrow and see for yourself." The Knight of Marshall then enthusiastically took out an arrow and handed it to the Knight of Bennett. As he enthusiastically instructed Knight Bennett on how to aim and how to operate the spreader. "Okay, Bennett, let's shoot at the wall over there," as Knight Marshall pointed toward the wall. The guest room was massive. It was nearly a 40-square-meter room. The wall that Marshall told Bennett to shoot towards was more than 20 meters in distance, and without saying anything, Bennett released his hand, and the arrow immediately disappeared on the bow. Within a split second, there was a harsh, shrill sound, and when they looked towards the wall, the arrow had already pierced through the wall that was made from boulders. Knight Bennett looked at the arrows on the wall, shocked and astonished of the power of the bow. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. He quickly walked over to the wall and knocked the wall a few times with his bare hands, confirming the bow's legitimacy. He was stunned so that he didn't even realize that the wall that he had just broken was his own guest room. He then pulled out the arrow from the wall, using a substantial amount of force. As he glanced at the wall, the arrow had made a hole that was 2./meters deep. When he looked over to the arrowhead shape had already deformed due to the incredible strength of the impact when the arrow strikes through the wall. "This be bow?" Knight Bennett looked at Abel as he said in complete astonishment and curiosity in how his son has acquired such a powerful weapon. As Abel was about to speak, the Knight of Marshall interrupted the conversation between the two and said, "Abel became a master blacksmith recently. Did you know that?" Then he was silent. When Knight of Bennett heard that his son had become a master blacksmith, he regretted giving Abel to Marshall as an adopted son. When Marshall repeated once again that his adopted son had become a master blacksmith, the facial expression on Bennett's face immediately filled with sorrow. Marshall was not able to understand Bennett's expression, so he continued speaking. "Abel designed Harry's bow for me so that I could withstand the orcs. Just today, I used the Harry bow to swiftly take down 12 orcs. All of them were level 6 and above 2. At it novel Bennett at." Knight Bennett felt a sense of uncontrollable shock and amazement as he gazed at Harry's bow that was on his hand. He now began to understand the reason why Abel had taken such a big risk to bring Harry's bow all the way from Harry's castle. In terms of what Marshall had said to him, knowing him for so long already, if half the things that he said were true, it was already good enough. However, what his old friend Marshall had done for Abel was beyond anyone's capability. Marshall risked his territory just for the sake of Abel's safety. Bennett knew that it would have been extremely difficult for him to make such a decision and to risk it all. The Knight of Bennett drew the bow once again. This time, he had discovered the advantages of the bow. The bow was hard to pull, but it was easy to aim at, and also it had a terrifying amount of power and destruction. Knight Marshal then looked directly at Bennett with a sense of mockery, and said with a smile, "I forgot to tell you, smarty pants, Harry's bow cannot be used without any ammunition." By the time that the Knight of Bennett had restored his bow, using a large amount of his combat chi, Knight Marshal was already laughing so hard, as if he had already forgotten that he had also made the same mistake before. Abel and the Knight Marshal did not stay long in Bennett's castle, and after instructing Knight Bennett on how to operate Harry's bow, the two quickly set off to go back to Harry's castle before anyone realized that they were missing. When they departed Bennett's castle, it was already dark. However, the two individuals were so familiar with the road, especially with Marshall, who had journeyed on this route countless times. Alongside with guidance of the moonlight in the night sky, the warhorses were also quite fast as they traveled back to their castle. As Abel and the Knight of Marshall were traveling back towards Harry's castle, Abel suddenly noticed a fire from a distance. Abel immediately informed the Knight of Marshall, "Look, Uncle Marshall, there's a fire there." The Knight Marshall glimpsed over towards the direction of where the fire was and said, "That's the direction of Lord Matthew's castle." Lord Matthew's fiefdom was sat within the middle of the Knight estate between Knight Marshall and Knight Bennett. The relationship between Knight Marshall and Lord Matthew wasn't too great. This was because Lord Matthew did not acknowledge knights as a noble position. Although in most parts of the world where humans lived, the knights were considered as nobles. However, in some rare parts of the world, some people did not consider them as nobles. Lord Matthew was one of them. Although Lord Matthew and Knight Marshall were neighbors, the relationship between them was pretty much limited to ceremonial meeting and saluting. Now that the Knight Marshall acknowledged the fire was originating from Lord Matthew's castle, he began to hesitate whether he should try to help them or not. There were a lot of reasons that caused Marshall to hesitate in assisting Lord Matthew's castle. Firstly, he could not expose his own identity. If he was caught and found to have left his territory, he would have been in big trouble. Secondly, he had to protect Abel. This meant that he was not assured that he could save Matthew's castle, as he had to stay alongside with Abel to guarantee his safety. Abel remained in silent. He gazed directly at Knight Marshall and thought to himself. He was going to let the Knight of Marshall decide this himself. Abel had never met Lord Matthew before. He had never heard his name being mentioned by someone else. Frankly, he didn't know what kind of person he was, and he didn't even know what he looked like. To Abel, he wasn't going to risk his life to assist a castle that he had never heard about before. Unless he was guaranteed that he was completely safe, then he would have gone and helped them. However, Knight Marshall decided to assist Lord Matthew's castle. "We will go and help them, but you must stay with me at all times. I cannot expose my identity in there. That's why you must step in and use your status as a master blacksmith." As Knight Marshall carefully instructed Abel with a serious tone, Abel quickly obeyed Knight Marshall's order and said, "Okay, Uncle Marshall, I will do as you say." Abel then took Harry's bow out of his horse saddle. Although he struggled with using Harry's bow due to its tough, laborious efforts, shooting only around 3 to 4 shots should have been fine for him. At the same time, Knight Marshall was holding his very own Harry's bow. As he placed an arrow onto his bow and was about to draw the bowstring, he quickly discovered another superior advantage of Harry's bow. The bow was especially suitable and advantageous when riding on a horse. When using a regular bow, one must use both legs, each on one side of the body, to properly control the horse. Then, the majority of energy and strength was needed to continuously pull the bow, while all at the same time trying to aim and shoot. However, Harry's bow was capable of holding the arrow with very little effort. By doing so, it allowed the operator to allocate more power to control their horse, as well as being able to have sufficient time to aim and shoot at their target without ease. The two warhorses that Abel and Marshall rode were very agile. As the two approached closer and closer towards the castle, Abel was the first to notice that the castle was in complete chaos. He saw that 4 wolf troopers were attacking the people who were trying to escape. When the 4-wolf rider heard the sound of hooves from the horses, they immediately shouted very loudly, and 2 of the wolf rider, equipped with long knives, instantly began charging directly towards Abel and Knight of Marshall. "Watch out! There's one right in front of you," and there's also one behind me," Knight of Marshall said. Abel aimed with care and precision at one of the wolf troopers that were charging directly towards him and immediately pulled the trigger. The bow was so powerful that it instantly shot through the wolf trooper's brain and created a hole. Shortly after, the second wolf trooper was promptly shot down by Knight of Marshall. The two wolf troopers who were still chasing the people down realized that their allied troops were shot down by Abel and Marshall. They then started to howl extremely loudly. Abel knew exactly what they were doing as he understood the orc language. The wolf troopers were summoning their allies inside the castle to come out and prepare for battle against Abel and Knight Marshall. Abel and the Knight of Marshall continued with their killing spree, as the two quickly killed the other two wolf troopers that were hunting down the people who were trying to escape. The wolf troopers did not stop charging towards Abel and Knight Marshall when they saw their allies being shot down. Instead, they charged furiously and madly towards them. The Knight of Marshall calmly shot down another 4 worgans. He then turned around to look back at Abel and said, "See, that's the nature and personalities of these worgans. They are very loyal." Abel nodded his head and promptly replied, "All right, Uncle Marshall. Thanks for letting me know," as he glanced over towards the 4 worgans that had been shot by Knight Marshall. For Abel, he wasn't shooting at the wolf troopers and the worgans since he felt a sense of resentment, but also couldn't bear the cruelty of killing these orcs. However, he held his trust in Uncle Marshall and believed that he would take care of them. Suddenly, 6 wolf riders were rushing out of the Matthew castle who were all hanging large packages on them. When Knight Marshall saw the 6 wolf riders coming out from the castle, a light flashed in his eyes and he hummed, "You're all dead." These wolf riders who were charging towards Abel and Marshall were still carrying the valuables from the castle, and their greed ultimately led to a much quicker death since they were much slower. Abel's and Marshall's knights had both shot their arrows towards their enemies, and the last arrows that had been shot were around 30 meters away from them. The 6 wolf troopers were all killed while they were charging towards them, including their worgans. As Knight Marshall watched the wolf riders, who have died on the way from charging towards them, he sighed and said, "This was a party of 10. These orcs are very strong, but they lack the protection of armor." He then glanced back at Abel and explained, "The Blacksmith Union had strictly forbidden anyone from the Blacksmith Union to forge armor for these orcs. Moreover, the orcs themselves had no skills or experiences in forging armor, so the only option they had was to use their bodies to block our arrows." The frightened crowd from Matthew's castle slowly discovered that all wolf troopers who were attacking them had been killed. As the crowd slowly gathered together, a middle-aged man who wore a suit approached Abel and Knight Marshall. Knight Marshall acted as if he was only assisting Abel as he stood behind him, so that Abel would have looked like the person who had killed most of the orcs, and he would have just been an assistant for him. "Hello, Sir Knight. Thank you for saving our lives. My name is Ken, Matthew's butler." Although he looked frightened while he spoke, the deep etiquette that Ken possessed made him appear extremely polite and full of courtesy. He then gave Abel a grateful salute. "I'm Abel Harry, and I accept your gratitude. May I ask where your master is?" Abel was very displeased and disappointed that Lord Matthew did not appear to thank them for their effort after their rescue. He and the Knight of Marshall risked their lives to assist Lord Matthew, but Lord Matthew did not even appear. Such a response seemed rude and puzzling to them. "Master Abel, my master has." When the butler heard Abel's question, he was already too shocked and tearful to even speak. The manner and courtesy Ken had displayed was suddenly gone, which was extremely peculiar for a noble-classed butler. Abel's name was spread so quickly throughout Harvest City that even the nobles knew that there was a young master blacksmith who lived in the area around Harvest City. When Abel heard the butler answering his question with tears, he already knew that something has happened to Lord Matthew. Abel then got off his horse and supported the butler with his hand to prevent him from falling. Currently, Abel's appearance was far beyond his age. He was 13 years old with a height that was nearly 1.7 meters tall. As Abel had just saved the nobility of Matthew's castle, he was able to temporarily act as the director to issue orders and various commands. This was one of the noble regulations, It applied when there was no noble to command a castle, and if the castle was rescued by other noble. All right, I'll need you to arrange men for law in order to be kept within the castle. Lord Matthew's message will be sent to the Lord of Harvest City. The Lord there will decide what happens after that. Abel said directly to Ken, "At it novel Benedette, as you will." The butler Ken held back his tears while Abel decided to keep Matthew's castle safe and stable from the evil and theft. Abel's command also meant that there wouldn't be anyone robbing, murdering, and stealing from the castle during these terrible times. Abel did not stay for too long. Within an hour or so, Matthew's castle was all quiet and peaceful again. The orcs' bodies were all piled up in the public square in the middle of the castle. The bodies of family members of the Matthew family were placed in the hall, and the other civilians that had deceased were placed in the side chambers. Everything within the storeroom was added with an additional iron lock to ensure that it was well protected and safe. Abel appointed the butler and 5 intact bodyguards to securely protect Matthew's family valuables and belongings until the owner of the property come forward and deal with the situation here. All the members within the Matthew family were killed during the orcs' attack. As the orcs rushed into the castle, they always looked for the most valuable and gorgeous room to rob and kill. The Matthew family was the owner of the castle, so it meant that they were the first noble victims of the attack. All of them were massacred. Since everything has been arranged by Abel, he had asked Ken to depart from the castle. Although Ken wanted Abel to stay until a new ruler was sent by the capital city, he didn't dare to oppose or criticize Abel's decision to leave, since Abel was a master as well as a noble too. As Abel departed Matthew's castle, Abel and Knight Marshall looked directly at each other in the eyes. The event that occurred here today made both of them very emotional. A long-continued generation of the Matthew family was all gone in one attack. If something like this happened to the Knight of Bennett or Knight of Marshall, Abel didn't even want to think about or imagine the consequences of that. From this event, he was now more acutely aware of the true cruelty of this world. The figure of Abel and Marshall Knight gradually was slowly disappearing into the night as they rode back towards the hairy castle. Ken, the butler, watched Abel's back from a distance, and his heart was filled with gratitude for Abel and Marshall's assistance and rescue during these current circumstances and conditions. Abel thought to himself, "These were the true and real knights that the world needs." Due to the recent attack of the orcs, the city owner Viscount Dickens had been feeling stressed. As a great knight, Viscount Dickens would much rather take his sword out and slash the team of orcs that had entered Harvest City. He would like it much more than sitting in the city palace, hearing news about his citizens or other castle owners being attacked by the orcs. Yesterday, Viscount Dickens had received a dead body of a war djinn and a map sent from Harry Castle. After a bit of investigation, he found that the maps depicted the gathering location of the orc squad. The orc squad would gather up in a few days and get ready to leave the human world with their flying beasts. This meant that the attack was almost over. If Viscount Dickens did not take action now to seek revenge, as a Viscount of the Duke, he would be badly embarrassed. It would affect his status. This morning, Viscount Dickens had already ordered a troop of 1,000 to ambush at the location marked on the map. This time, Viscount Dickens had dispatched 3 elite knights and 30 knights. This small troop of 1,000 was an elite troop. They possessed enough fighting power to withstand a small-scale battle. According to the Knight of Marshall's letter, this information was obtained by his adopted son, Master Blacksmith Abel, after killing a wolf rider with a bear trap. Viscount Dickens was very intrigued by this new Master Blacksmith of Harvest City. As far as he knew, this Master Blacksmith was awarded the title of Master through forging magic weapons. Viscount Dickens has been considering whether he should ask this new Master to forge a magic weapon for him. "My lord, someone from Matthew Castle wants to come in and report a funeral," said the butler. When Viscount Dickens heard these words, he knew that another castle had been attacked. He then said to the butler, "Let him in." After a while, a lost and frightened servant entered. He cried as he came in, "My lord, Lord Matthew and every single member of his family had lost their lives in the orcs' attacks." The abolishment of a noble family was not a trivial matter. Viscount Dickens knew about the Matthew family. Although they were very small, with only inherited around 100 square miles of land, they still had around 100 years of history. "Quickly, tell me what happened," said Viscount Dickens. Perhaps it was because of trauma or the lack of experience, but the servant had not explained the matter clearly. He continued to speak with a stutter. It was no use. Under normal circumstances, if Lord Matthew wanted to report something to Viscount Dickens, he would send his butler Ken, or he would even direct go to the city palace himself. As a result of this attack, the butler could no longer leave Matthew Castle. Therefore, they could only send a more well-spoken servant, one who was capable of reporting the current situation. The servant understood the intent of Viscount Dickens. At this time, he also remembered what Butler Ken had told him. It was said that, upon arriving at the city palace, get to the point as soon as possible. The city lord would not have time to slowly listen to you. The servant proceeded to explain. In the evening, a group of wolf riders attacked the castle. The gates of Matthew Castle was opened, and the wolf riders entered. When they began their massacre, Master Abel was passing by, and he helped us defend them together. After Master Abel made sure the castle was organized again, Butler Ken ordered me to report to the lord of the city. Finally, after all that mumbling, the servant was able to explain the situation clearly. Had it novel been at Master Abel again? Viscount Dickens did not expect that at all. These kinds of actions, such as rescuing a noble family in danger, were appreciated and respected by all nobles. Although Abel failed to save the life of Lord Matthew, the castle was still completely preserved. If an orc attack was successful, they would kill all the people they could find and burn the castle down. Master Abel must be rewarded for this deed, as well as for providing the orcs' gathering map. If the ambush was successful, these two deeds combined would be enough for extra rewards from the king of the duchy. These military service rewards were very difficult to be called off by anyone, because even if the king was daring enough to reject it, he would have to risk having his citizens give up on fighting for him in the future. All the nobles and the king understood this by heart. Although throughout these years, the king had tried to suppress the influence of the nobles, if they were qualified for an outstanding military service reward, they would always be rewarded in a way that was equitable to their service. After the gate of the castle was opened, 10 of the cavalry rushed out. There were 2 grieving mount wolves remaining in the battlefield. When they saw the human appearing, they immediately rushed forward and prepared for their last fight. However, the 2 mount wolves only got the chance to take a few steps before arrows pierced their skull from the guarding wall. The cavalries looked at their leader, the knight of martial in shiny armor, with adoration. Their leader signified the safety of the estate and their families. Other than the 2 mount wolves that were shot, there were also 4 inferno bovine outside the castle. All the other surviving mounts had ran along with the orcs. However, the inferno bovines were often not very smart and not that loyal either. Therefore, since inferno bovines were often worth quite a lot of money, they could be sold in the market after domestication. After the cavalries dragged the dead bodies and the 4 inferno bovine back to the castle, the knight of martial had already decided the fate of these bovines. He would convert his horse carriages into bovine carriages. He would keep 2 for himself and the other 2 for Abel. This way, the knight of martial could feel less guilty for taking his adopted son's weapon. However, the knight of martial actually didn't felt that guilty for taking Abel's bow. He knew if Abel could make a bow of this kind, he could make a second one. Also, the knight of martial thought that if didn't take the bow from Abel, maybe Abel would not have the motivation to make another bow again. The crisis had been resolved. There shouldn't be any more orcs who would dare to seek death at Harry Castle. Therefore, the knight of martial ordered the guards to patrol while he could have some rest. These days, the knight of martial had been very stressed, and he had never taken off his armor. He had to be the leader of the castle. If the orcs had appeared near a castle, the nobles of that castle could no longer leave their castles. This was a rule of war established for all mankind. If a common enemy of human had appeared in a noble's estate, and the noble left his estate, it would signify that he had given up his estate. This rule did not include the conflicts between humans. If two humans were battling against each other, and if one party knew that they couldn't win, surrender was always approved. Furthermore, because of the noble prisoner of war rule, no one would really want to take such a risk and pick a fight with a noble, unless they really possessed a deep hatred towards them. After returning to the Blacksmith Guild, Abel began his repetitive work again. He was making another 2 composite bows. He gathered the last 4 heavy bows in the warehouse, but since the Knight of Martial knew what Abel was doing, he did not become dissatisfied. This time, Abel had made a lot more than last time. He made 4 bearings, and even made a few extra of the large springs in preparation for upgrading his carriage. Abel was traumatized every time he rode on a carriage. He was too accustomed to the smoothness cars in his previous life, while the carriage of this world felt like it was dancing on rocks every time it moved. In the next 2 days, Abel spent all his energy on making the composite bows. Since he had gained the experience from his last attempt, the 2 composite bows he made this time had been further refined. Because the orcs were now all driven away, Abel decided to go outside to test out the range of his new bows. Abel perfected the scale of the sighting device. It was divided into 100 meters, 100 to 200 meters, 200 meters to 400 meters. Abel realized when shooting beyond 400 meters, the power of the arrow would be greatly reduced. So Abel estimated that the maximum range of these composite bow was within 400 meters. Any range beyond that would be impossible to kill anything. At most, it could only badly injure the enemy. Furthermore, the speed of the arrow would also be greatly reduced after 400 meters. Therefore, the enemy could easily avoid it. Upon completing the 2 composite bows, Abel was eager to send the bow to his father. Therefore, he had proposed to the Knight of Martial to visit Bennett Castle. Uncle Martial, I'll try to learn these secret techniques. I have Black Wind, so these 2 secrets techniques should be very easy to master. Of course, Abel understood the importance of horsemanship. Since he already owned an elite-level mount, all he needed now was the adequate skill set to match it. The Knight of Martial did not avoid Abel's curiosity. He pressed the back of a knight biography novel on his bookcase. The knight biography novel fell inward, followed by a noise of mechanical gears triggering. The bookcase split into 2, revealing a secret room. Come on, you have to know about this place. These are all the collections of Harry Castle, the Knight of Martial said with a touch of pride. I've collected everything here through decades of hard work. Usually, I wouldn't even let anyone know this secret room, let alone showing it off. To a person who loved to show off, hiding things away was very difficult for the Knight of Martial. But finally, today, there was someone he would share it with. This secret room was huge. Countless weapons were hanging on the walls, which included those from both the orcs and humans. There even seemed to be a traditional elves bow. As the Knight of Martial saw that Abel was intrigued by the weapons on the wall, he began to sigh in awe. These are all from the enemies that I've slain throughout the years. After defeating an enemy, it didn't matter if you decided to kill them or not. Keeping their weapons was a common practice among nobles, especially knights. They were trophies. Besides, every knight would most likely adore their collection as well. In the middle of the secret room, there was a huge, long table. On the table, there were a few thick books with bold titles, including geography, agriculture, and some non-combat related secret techniques. For example, Abel was drawn by a book about how to use cleansing water. Abel had heard of cleansing water before. It was a potion often used by women to maintain their skin. But for a grown man in his 40s to use it, Abel frowned just by thinking about it. After the Knight of Martial saw Abel's distaste towards the clearing water secret technique, he thought that he had to make an explanation. This is not just an ordinary formula for clearing water, it is the noble elves' cleansing water formula. Can't you see how good the elf skin is? I spent good money on this book back in the days. Abel wanted to challenge the Knight of Martial by saying that the elves' good skin was because of their genetic, not because of a beauty formula. Abel was very disappointed by this collection of the Knight of Martial. Finally, Abel saw the 2 Harry's Heritage Secret Techniques of Knight's Guide placed at the very corner of the table. From the placement of these books, The cleansing water formula seemed much more important to the Knight of Martial than his heritage's secret techniques. Upon picking up the 2 secret technique guide, Abel was getting ready to leave the secret room. Suddenly, a square sign attracted Abel's gaze. The sign was engraved with some patterns that seemed very familiar with Abel. He was 110% sure this was a rune, but did not know exactly which order was this rune. Abel walked toward the square sign and picked it up. He looked towards the Knight of Martial and asked, "Uncle Martial, where did you get this from?" "This was sent to me by a wizard friend. He said if I crush this sign when I am in danger, it can help me shake off the enemy," the Knight of Martial said after recalling for a while. "Wow, you have a wizard friend?" Abel widened his eyes. Abel had always only heard about wizards, but no one ever described them to him in detail. "Yeah, when I was still in Baikong City, I rescued a wizard in a mission. At that time, his magical power was exhausted, and there were a few wolves nearby." When the Knight of Martial thought of a wizard in such an embarrassing situation, he gave a small chuckle. He then proceeded to say, "The wizard and I later had become friends. He was still a novice wizard at the time, and since he knew I would be going to the battlefield, he paid a big cost in exchange for this rune sign, to save my life when the time comes." "What is the difference between a wizard and a knight?" Abel asked. "The difference? The wizards can only use magic, so their power doesn't have many practical uses, but the best thing about being a wizard was longevity." Martial Knight's eyes flashed a hint of envy, and then went on to say, "The lifespan of a lesser official wizard can reach up to 300 years, and each time they level up, it will further increase the life expectancy. But knights like us, even if we became an elite knight, we can only increase our lifespan for 50 years. 300 years old." Abel's eyes were burning with intense yearning. He immediately asked, "How can I become a wizard?" "It is not easy to become a wizard. First of all, there must be a middleman. The wizards are disconnected from the people of this world. They are not your down-to-earth average citizens. Things like family, country, and ethnicity don't seem to concern them a single bit. Ordinary people have no way of approaching them, let alone being a part of them. To become a wizard, you have to process the right aptitude. It's the most important thing. Therefore, every person who wants to be a wizard must pass an examination." The Knight of Martial saw the yearning in Abel's eyes. He couldn't help but smile. "When I first discovered that the lifespan of an official wizard was 300 years, I also asked my wizard friend to help me become a wizard. But I didn't pass the examination." The Knight of Martial was a bit stunned, but soon he began smiling again and said, "If you want to participate in the wizard examination, you have to wait until you're 15 years old. By that time, I will bring you to my wizard friend to ask for advice. If you can pass the examination, your achievements will surpass all knight." This was the most gratifying thing Abel had heard these days. If he became a wizard, he could not only live longer, he could also be able to use the Tome of Town portal from the Horadric box, which required magic, and the only way to use magic was becoming a wizard. "Why must I be 15 years old before I can take the examination?" Abel asked eagerly. "At it novel Benedat. I heard that it is because no one below the age of 15 can understand the mystery of magic. Also, your body isn't developed enough to absorb magical power." The Knight of Martial knew what was on Abel's mind. He then went on to say, "I will take you to the examination as soon as you turn 15. It should take some time before we can get to Baikong City, and by the time you've finished learning some of my heritage's secret techniques, you should be around 15 years old." Through these words of the Knight of Martial, Abel understood how much the knights concern and cherish him. Even little times like this was taken into account. Abel was preparing to put the rune sign back on the wall. The Knight of Martial waved his hand at him and said, "Since you seem very interested in this rune sign, you can keep it. All these years it had just been sitting here, I never have the chance to use it. So let's not let it go to waste." "Thank you so much, Uncle Martial." Abel happily put away the rune sign, which would also be very helpful when it comes to studying runes. "No worries." The Knight of Martial patted Abel's head intimately, and the two left the secret room. When Abel got back to his room, he realized the Knight of Martial's birthday would be in 10 days. The present he prepared initially had already been received early by the Knight of Martial. However, Abel would still feel very sorry if he didn't show any appreciation during the knight's actual birthday. He had to start preparing another present now. Abel practiced a bit of the knight's breathing technique for a while in his room and analyzed the battle he had today. The orcs had to be mobile and kept a fast pace in the human world. They could not wear any heavy armor, let alone carrying a shield. Therefore, that's where the composite bow, or the so-called Harry's bow, could shine. To forge a bow according to the methods of this world, other than using some extraordinary material, it was impossible to forge a 400-pound bow. This was because no material with the length and thinness of a normal bow arm could withstand 400 pounds of tension. The composite bow, on the other hand, had a shorter bow arm, and all the other parts were made with steel. It was an extraterrestrial technology, a device that was meant for mass murder in a world in its cold weapon era. Unless if a wolf rider possessed extreme power, if they didn't have armor or shields, they would most likely be killed by the Harry bow. The only downside was that the force required to pull on the Harry's bow was very demanding. Even a level 5 novice knight, such as Abel, could barely do it. That aside, the most important thing was that Abel had finally gotten the information he wanted about wizards, and he would soon be able to participate in the wizard's examination. Although he still needed to wait another 2 years. He decided to dedicate these 2 years to double down his effort on becoming a knight. It didn't matter if he was going to become a wizard or a blacksmith in the end. Whatever his future might be like, a strong body would always be appreciated.